good evening, or whatever the night feels like where you are. If you're hearing this, you've stepped into a small, flickering corner of the world, where the lights dim just enough for your imagination to wander, and maybe, just maybe, for something to wander back. Tonight's episode isn't just a collection of stories. Think of it as a long, wavering breath held between midnight and dawn. 5 whispers carried through dark hallways, old forests, empty basements, forgotten kitchens, and places that never truly let go of the people who visit them. We begin at the edge of a silent lake, where echoes don't behave the way they should. Then we follow a veteran lost inside a war that never ended. We descend into a museum that doesn't display art, but preserves it. We stand guard at a parking level where a promise was buried alive. And finally, we sit at a table where perfection is served hot, and flavor is more than taste, it's sacrifice. You won't find jump scares here. No cheap tricks. Just the slow, creeping kind of horror that moves with the patience of settling dust. The kind that waits quietly in the corners of your vision. I'll ask only one thing of you. Listen closely. Let the darkness breathe a little. And if you feel something brushing along the edge of your thoughts, an echo, a memory, a whisper, don't pull away. They only want to be heard, because the night has its own way of telling stories. And tonight, it's telling them through us. Welcome to the hours where shadows breathe. Welcome to Little Dream Horror Radio. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. The first time Liam heard the lake speak, he told himself it was nothing more than wind slipping across the surface. An ordinary sound dressed in moonlight, but something in the way the water trembled made the breath in his lungs pause, as if waiting for a second confirmation. The night had been unusually still, the kind of stillness that feels intentional, as though the world were holding its posture for someone else to make the next move, and Liam, with his boots sinking slightly into the damp moss along the Blackwood shoreline, felt for a moment that he had stepped into a memory that didn't belong to him. The air smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet, metallic and cold, mixing with a faint note of old pine and the sour tang of algae rising from the lake's shifting skin. He had been drawn here by stories, half-whispered local legends about the vanished tribe that once thrived on this land. Stories that other archaeologists dismissed as exaggerations from bored park rangers. But Liam's mind, ever hungry for meaning buried beneath ruins and silt, refused to let the tales go. Perhaps, he thought, it was the silence of his own life. The long days cataloging artifacts for a museum basement no one visited. The quiet apartment filled only with the hum of an unreliable refrigerator that made him crave mysteries large enough to drown in. So when he first arrived at Blackwood, under a sky smeared with low-hanging clouds and a drizzle that glittered like powdered glass, he had felt something ignite beneath his sternum, a soft thrill, the promise of discovery. He walked the perimeter of the lake slowly, feeling the texture of the mud change under his boots, noticing how the waterline seemed uneven, like a jawline someone had shaved in the dark. The shoreline was littered with smooth stones and knotted roots, the remnants of trees that once grew too close to the water. Liam tried to listen past the sounds of the nocturnal insects, past the soft murmur of water meeting shore, straining to hear something that might confirm the legends he'd been told. Locals claimed the tribe disappeared overnight, no bodies, no signs of departure, only an empty camp found at the north side of the lake. They said the chief, desperate to protect his people from something that had stalked them during the final winter, had hidden their knowledge inside a ceremonial artifact and buried it by the water. A foolish story by all reasonable standards, but even an embellished myth can leave behind a fragment of truth, and Liam had always been drawn to those fragments, like a moth circling a lantern's warm glass. He set down his pack near a cluster of reeds and crouched, running his fingers across the damp soil. The rain earlier had softened the ground, making it easier to dig, and as he dug the edge of his shovel in, the earth gave way with a muted sigh. He worked methodically, carving out neat sections of soil, feeling the rhythmic strain of effort pull at his shoulders. Each scoop released the earthy scent of decomposing leaves, a rich, dark smell that always reminded him of old libraries and locked archives. As he unearthed the deeper layers of silt, he noticed the soil change color, shifting from brown to a darker, almost black shade that clung to the metal of the shovel like oil. He frowned, leaning closer. brushing the clumps apart with gloved fingers. Something was down there, something with edges too straight to be stone and too firm to be root. His pulse flickered. He dug faster, but not carelessly. He had spent years learning patience with fragile objects. Gradually, the outline of a small wooden box emerged, its surface mottled with damp moss and silt, the wood darkened but remarkably intact. Liam felt the hair on his arms rise, not from cold but from recognition, some deep instinct telling him that this box had been waiting, undisturbed, for longer than he could easily comprehend. He lifted it free from the hole, wiping mud away with gentle strokes, and as he did, a faint crackle of static drifted in from the lake behind him. He glanced at the water, but the surface was perfectly still, almost glass-like, reflecting the clouds overhead with an unnerving clarity. The box wasn't locked. Its lid was sealed only by time and dampness. Liam hesitated, suddenly aware of how quiet the night had become, too quiet. The insects had stopped their chorus. Even the distant croak of frogs had faded. He felt a pressure in his chest, a sensation as though someone were leaning close behind him, waiting. He opened the box slowly. Inside, lying on a bed of brittle, fibrous material that might once have been woven cloth, was a shard of obsidian. It was large enough to fill his palm, smooth except for a line of etched symbols carved with tools far older than anything modern. The runes shimmered faintly despite the lack of light, as though reflecting a flame flickering somewhere far beneath the lake. His breath hitched. Obsidian was not native to this region. Its presence here was impossible. And yet, as the tip of his finger brushed the surface, the world seemed to inhale sharply. A whisper fluttered through his skull, a rush of sound that wasn't sound at all. A voice formed from the vibration of his own nerves. It was like hearing someone speak from beneath several feet of water. The consonants warped and elongated, each word coded in an ancient cadence he couldn't recognize but somehow understood. It didn't speak in sentences. It spoke in sensations. Cold, hunger, longing, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against the back of his thoughts. Liam stumbled backward, clutching his hand to his chest. The whisper didn't fade but coiled itself along the edges of his consciousness, brushing softly against the folds of his memory, like fingertips testing a locked door. He breathed hard, tasting the metallic sting of adrenaline on his tongue, watching the obsidian tremble faintly in the box as though responding to his fear. He didn't drop it. He couldn't. The compulsion to examine it more closely was almost magnetic. When he touched the rune again, the whisper sharpened, forming a single word, or something close to a word, the sound swelling like a bubble rising from deep water. Release. His heart convulsed. The air around him thickened, as if saturated with unseen moisture, and the lake behind him rippled though no wind stirred. He felt a sudden certainty that he was not alone, though he saw nothing but darkness stretching across the water. He closed the box with trembling hands and took a step back, feeling the damp soil squelch beneath his heel. The whisper receded slightly, but it didn't vanish. It stayed just behind his thoughts, watching, waiting. He tried to steady his breath, reminding himself of the countless artifacts he had handled before, objects burdened with superstition but ultimately harmless. Yet nothing he'd ever found had spoken to him. Nothing had pushed its presence into his mind like this. He forced his gaze away from the box and scanned the shoreline again, searching for any sign that the environment had changed. But everything looked as it had before, the reeds shifting gently, the clouds dragging their shadows across the lake, the faint tremble of distant lightning flickering behind the tree line. But then he noticed something subtle. The reflection on the lake no longer matched the sky. The clouds above were moving, their shapes drifting slowly east, but the reflection remained fixed, frozen, as though the lake had captured an earlier moment and refused to let it go. A soft chill crawled up Liam's spine, settling at the base of his neck. He needed time to think, to catalog what he had found, and to decide whether he should contact the local historical society or continue alone. He placed the box into his pack with careful hands. The moment the obsidian disappeared from view, the strange pressure around him eased slightly, like a predator retreating into the underbrush, but keeping its gaze fixed on its prey. Liam slung the pack over his shoulder, feeling the added weight pull at him, as though the box were sinking through the fabric, trying to return to the soil. He stepped away from the dig site, intending to return to his cabin on the south side of the lake, but some small, almost imperceptible shift made him pause. There were footprints in the mud. Not his, not human. They were shallow impressions, no larger than a child's hand, but elongated, with too many joints, the toes tapering into points that looked more like claws than anything shaped by evolution. The tracks formed a trail leading toward the water, and as Liam followed them with his eyes, his breath grew thin. The footprints stopped at the edge of the lake, and the soil around them was disturbed, as though something had risen from the water and stood there watching him dig. He stared into the dark water for a long moment, waiting for a ripple, a movement, anything that might reveal what had been there. But the lake remained still, its surface smooth and blank, reflecting only the distorted moonlight. Liam backed away slowly, every instinct in his body telling him to leave the shoreline immediately. He turned toward the path leading through the trees, but before he stepped into the darkness of the forest, he heard it again, a sound so faint he almost convinced himself he imagined it. A whisper, drifting across the lake, threading through the reeds, nudging the back of his skull like a cold finger. Release. Liam closed his eyes, and for the first time that night, he wondered whether the story of the vanished tribe had been a warning rather than a legend. Liam hadn't realized how heavy his breathing had become until he reached the tree line, and the air seemed to thicken, cool, and slide over his skin like a damp sheet. The forest around Blackwood Lake was not loud to begin with. Even in daylight it possessed that peculiar hush of places long abandoned by human hands, but tonight the silence felt swollen, as though it were holding its breath with him. He moved cautiously along the narrow dirt path leading to his cabin, forcing himself not to glance back toward the lake. The pack on his shoulders seemed to pull unevenly, the weight of the buried box shifting in unnatural ways, nudging the small of his back with a movement he couldn't fully rationalize. He tried telling himself the sensation was only his imagination responding to stress, but the whisper that had slipped through his skull earlier had lodged itself deep, a metallic sheen beneath his thoughts, and each time he attempted to push it aside, it unfurled like smoke, reclaiming its place. His footsteps rasped softly over dead leaves, and he could feel the wetness of the forest floor seeping through the stitching of his boots, the cold threading up his ankles. Every so often, a faint shiver ran through him, not from the air but from something coiling in the space behind his sternum, as though the obsidian shard was settling into his awareness like a root seeking fertile ground. The cabin emerged through the darkness in a muted silhouette, a simple wooden structure perched between two ancient pines. Liam reached the porch steps and paused, listening again to the strange absence of night sounds. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Even animals with nocturnal rhythms should have resumed their movements by now. He unlocked the door and slipped inside, closing it quickly, as though afraid something might follow him through. The interior was dim, lit faintly by the warm flicker of the lantern he'd left burning earlier. The light painted the rough wooden walls with the soft glow of amber, shadows curling gently along the ceiling beams. For a moment, the quiet inside felt safer than the forest behind him, but then the whisper came again, faint, like a breath sliding between cracks in old stone, a sound that was not a sound, threading itself through the rhythm of his heartbeat. Liam swallowed hard. He set the pack on the small table in the center of the room, careful not to jostle it, and wiped the damp from his hands against his pants. He paced slowly around the cabin, touching familiar objects, the dented kettle near the stove, the old chipped mug he always forgot to replace, the stack of field notebooks on the chair. He tried grounding himself in the ordinary, counting the small comforts of his routine, but his thoughts kept circling back to the box, to the weight of it, to the rooms that glowed without light. He approached the table without meaning to, drawn by a compulsion that felt both internal and foreign. As he stood over the pack, he felt the faint brush of warmth. No, not warmth exactly, more like the memory of warmth radiating from inside the canvas. It made his fingers twitch. He hesitated, but only for a moment, before he unzipped the pack and lifted the box out again. The wood felt colder now than it had at the lake shore, as though it had been submerged in deep water. His breath fogged slightly as he exhaled, though the cabin's temperature had not changed. He opened the lid. Inside, the obsidian shard lay motionless, but Liam felt a subtle pressure in his mind, like a thought trying to assert itself before he could form his own. He stared at the etched runes, tracing them with his eyes. The symbols seemed to shift, their edges softening and rearranging like reflections on disturbed water. The whisper rose not from the room, but from inside the marrow of his bones. It spoke not in words, but in a layering of impressions, a sensation of vast depth, of ancient hunger, of something long confined pressing against the walls of its prison. His pulse fluttered in his neck. He tried to step back, but his body remained still. It was as though the obsidian held him in place with invisible fingers curling around his will. Only when the lantern flickered sharply, its light shrinking, then swelling, did he pull away, slamming the lid shut with a gasp he hadn't known was trapped in his throat. The whisper faded slightly, recoiling as though the closing of the box muffled its reach. Liam stumbled backward into the chair, rubbing his hands together to dispel the numbness. A part of him wanted to throw the box into the stove, to burn it, to crush the shard, to do anything that would sever the connection he felt tightening. But another part, a quieter, more insidious part, insisted he couldn't, that the artifact was important, that it was meant to be found, that he, specifically, was meant to find it. He pressed his palms to his eyes, breathing slowly. He tried to remember the stories he'd heard from the locals during his first week in Blackwood, the ones they told with uneasy smiles and lowered voices. They had spoken of strange echoes across the lake at night, echoes that were not reflections of sound, but something else. Voices repeating words no one had spoken, messages from a time before any living memory. They had said the tribe had tried to silence the lake, to cage whatever resided beneath it. But that caging had taken something from them in return. They had vanished soon after, leaving behind only fragments of warning, carvings on old stones, broken tools, markings near the water's edge that no archaeologist could fully decipher. A shudder passed through him. He wondered now if those warnings had been more literal than symbolic. He wondered whether the artifact he had found was not a ceremonial treasure, but a seal designed to restrain something that had once roamed freely. And he wondered, with a creeping unease, whether touching the shard had loosened that restraint. He stood abruptly, needing space, needing movement to keep his thoughts from spiraling. He paced the small cabin again, feeling the floorboards creak under his weight. The air had become thicker, heavier, as if saturated with humidity despite no visible change. He approached the window, brushing aside the thin curtain. The forest outside was a tangle of dark shapes, shifting gently with the breeze. But he saw no animals, no flicker of movement beyond the sway of branches. The lake itself, barely visible through the trees, looked wrong. Its surface was too smooth, too still, as though it were made of polished stone instead of water. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass, eyes fixed on the distant shimmer. As he watched, a ripple traced itself across the lake, slow, deliberate, as if something beneath had brushed against the underside of the surface. He leaned closer. His breath fogged the window. The ripple widened, moving steadily toward the shore, toward the spot where he had dug up the box. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. He pressed his hand against the pane, willing himself to see more clearly. The ripple grew, then paused in the shallows. For a moment, it appeared to swell into a faint shape, tall, elongated, translucent, before dissolving back into darkness. Liam blinked rapidly. He couldn't tell if it had been real or a trick of reflection. He backed away from the window, his skin prickling with a wave of cold. He reached for his jacket, intending to step onto the porch for a clearer view. But the moment he touched the doorknob, a sharp whisper cracked inside his head, startling enough to make him recoil as though burned. This time, the whisper was not a suggestion. It was a command. Do not leave. Liam gripped the side of the table, his breath catching. That voice, if it could be called a voice, felt stronger now, less like a distant echo and more like something standing just behind him, close enough to fog the back of his consciousness. He clenched his jaw and tried to shove the sensation away, but his thoughts tangled, slipping from his grasp. He felt a sudden weight in his limbs, as though invisible water were pulling him downward. His knees buckled, and he steadied himself against the table, Gasping, he closed his eyes. And for a moment, just a flicker, he saw something that was not the cabin, not the lake, but a place of darkness stretching infinitely in all directions, a void layered with currents of pale, wavering shapes, like silhouettes drifting just beyond the reach of comprehension. They moved slowly, their forms dissolving and reforming, as though searching for a pattern that eluded them. At the center of that void was a single pulse of light, faint but steady, beating like a heart submerged in deep water, and around it, he sensed a hunger old enough to predate language. His eyes snapped open. He staggered backward, knocking over the chair. The sensation faded, leaving only the echo of it, like an afterimage burnt onto the inside of his eyelids. He inhaled sharply, feeling his chest tighten. He knew, then, that the shard was not merely an artifact. It was a door, and he had opened it, if only a crack. He forced himself to sit on the edge of the bed, gripping the blanket beneath him as though it could anchor him. He needed to think, to regain control of his mind before panic swallowed him whole. But every thought was punctuated by the whisper, curling through his skull like tendrils of cold mist. He wondered how long he could resist it. He wondered whether resistance mattered at all. He looked again at the pack on the table, at the closed wooden box resting inside. The room felt smaller now, as though the very walls leaned inward. He sensed that the shard was not content to remain in darkness, that it wanted to be seen, to be held, to be used. Liam swallowed hard. His hands trembled. He whispered to himself just to hear a human voice, even if only his own, and the sound felt strangely thin, fragile, as though the air around him swallowed it before it could fully form. Outside, the lake rippled again, and the silence that followed felt like a held breath. Liam woke long before dawn. Though he couldn't remember falling asleep, his eyelids felt grainy, as if they'd been scraped by sand, and when he sat up, the blanket slipped off his chest with a strange heaviness, dampened by a cold he didn't remember letting into the cabin. The light inside was low and pallid, thin strands of silver filtering through the cracks between the shutters. But something about the stillness made him hesitate before moving further, an instinctive pause, like the one he'd felt at the lake when the world seemed to wait for him to make the first sound. His breath came out in a shallow fog, drifting lazily in front of him before dissolving. The air smelled faintly of wet stone, a scent he normally associated with the lake's shoreline, but now it clung to the wooden walls, as though carried inside by an unseen tide. He rubbed his face with shaking hands, trying to banish the strange residue lingering in his thoughts. He had dreamed he was sure of it, but the details slid away when he reached for them, leaving nothing behind except a thin smear of darkness and the memory of something pressing lightly against his forehead, like a fingertip made of cold light. His heartbeat stuttered. He turned his head toward the table, expecting to see only the pack where it had been, but the wooden box lay beside it now, its lid slightly askew. Liam froze. He had not removed the box from the pack. He was certain of it. He had zipped the pack shut, sealed it completely. Yet the box sat there as though placed deliberately, waiting. The whisper stirred immediately, subtle but insistent, like a string tightening inside his skull. He swallowed hard. His hands twitched toward the box, fingers curling involuntarily before he forced them to relax. "Not yet," he murmured under his breath, though he knew the words weren't meant for himself. He stood slowly, muscles stiff, joints aching in ways that suggested far more than a single night had passed. He approached the box, each step filling him with a quiet dread that pooled beneath his ribs. The lid moved slightly as he reached for it, shifting with a scraping whisper that didn't match the softness of wood sliding against wood. For a moment, he thought something inside had pushed it. He hesitated, staring down at the carved edges. The rune symbols seemed darker than before, as though soaked in a shade of black his eyes weren't meant to interpret. The whisper unraveled again, blooming gently at the base of his skull. "Come back." Not a command this time, but an invitation, a caress. Liam pressed both palms against the table, leaning forward, breathing slowly through his teeth. He was losing pieces of himself. He felt it in the gaps between his thoughts, the way certain memories came only with an effort that felt disproportionate. He tried recalling his brother's face and found only fragments. A shape of a smile, the echo of a voice, laughing at something long ago, but no eyes, no concrete details. It frightened him, though even that fear felt muted, wrapped in a kind of fog. He straightened abruptly and stepped back from the table, needing distance, needing air. The cabin walls felt too close, their wood grain shifting subtly in the corners of his vision, as though breathing in slow cycles he couldn't see directly. He slipped on his boots and shoved open the door, stumbling into the cold morning. The forest greeted him with a breathless hush, the kind that precedes snowfall, though the sky above remained a flat, heavy gray. The path that led toward the lake was slick with dew. Each blade of grass bowed beneath tiny droplets that trembled as he passed. He walked without clear purpose, driven only by an instinct that both repelled and compelled him. The closer he drew to the water, the sharper the smell of wet stone became, and with it came a faint vibration in the air, as though the very atmosphere hummed with tension. When he reached the shoreline, he stopped short. The lake was still unnaturally so, its surface an unbroken mirror reflecting the gray morning sky. But the reflection was wrong again. The clouds overhead were drifting slowly east, yet the reflection remained static, frozen in place like a photograph. Liam's breath caught. He stepped closer, crouching near the edge. The water smelled old, metallic, like something sealed in a crypt. He reached out a hand but stopped inches above the surface, unable to make himself touch it. As he hovered there, the ripple appeared. It began at the center of the lake, a single, subtle pulse, barely visible unless one knew to look for it. The pulse spread outward in concentric rings, disturbingly symmetrical, as though produced by something large shifting far below. Liam leaned closer, squinting. Through the shifting silvery layer of water, he thought he glimpsed movement, slow, undulating shapes, too defined to be fish and too amorphous to be human forms. Shadows, bodies. Something ancient, reorganizing itself beneath the lake's skin. His pulse quickened, he blinked hard, and the shapes blurred, blending into the darkness below. A faint echo drifted across the water, his name. Soft, elongated, pulled thin like a stretched whisper. Liam. He staggered back, heart hammering. The voice was familiar, almost soothing, yet subtly distorted, as though it had been played through waterlogged lungs. He turned in every direction, seeking its source, but the forest remained still. Then he realized with a sinking dread that the voice hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside his mind. He pressed a trembling hand to his temple, trying to steady himself. He needed to think. He needed clarity. He needed something. Anything. His thoughts spiraled like water draining through a crack. The shard had connected him to something vast, something that existed far deeper than the lake bed, something that wanted to rise. And he didn't know what role he played, but he felt it tightening around him like a net. He straightened slowly and forced himself to walk the perimeter of the lake, scanning the mud for more footprints like those he'd seen the night before. None. Yet he felt watched, felt eyes tracking his every movement from just below the surface, patient and ancient. As he reached the north side of the lake, where the vanished tribe had once camped generations ago, he paused. The ground here was different, firmer, less disturbed by runoff. He knelt, brushing away leaves. Beneath them, faint carvings scratched along a flat stone, symbols that echoed the runes on the obsidian. His breath shivered. The tribe had tried to warn him, or anyone who might come after them. But the carvings were incomplete, gouged violently, as though someone or something had tried to erase the instructions. The whisper surged, abrupt and cold. Not here. Liam flinched, hands clenching instinctively around nothing. Come back. The tug in his mind pulled him toward the cabin, toward the shard. He resisted for a heartbeat. 2, 3, but the pressure mounted until his skull throbbed. He staggered forward, unsure whether his legs moved because he chose to or because the whisper guided him. The forest seemed to bend slightly around him, the trees leaning inward as he passed, their branches whispering in a language that reminded him of the underwater voice. He stumbled once, catching himself on a trunk slick with moss. His fingers sank deeper into the bark than they should have, as though the wood softened under his touch. He jerked his hand away, breath stuttering. By the time he reached the cabin, the air inside him buzzed with a kind of electric tension. His hand shook as he opened the door. The box still lay on the table, lid ajar, the faintest thread of black shimmer leaking from the gap like smoke. He approached slowly, each step landing softly on the creaking boards. The whisper grew stronger, curling around the edges of his consciousness, not as a single voice but as many layered, overlapping, rising and falling like the echo of chants deep underwater. He pressed a trembling hand against the table for support and lifted the lid fully. The obsidian shard pulsed faintly, a heartbeat of shifting darkness. He stared, mesmerized. The pulse grew stronger, and then the surface of the shard rippled, as though something inside pressed outward. A shape emerged, not fully visible, but enough to freeze Liam where he stood. A handprint, or something like a handprint, elongated, with too many joints, pressing outward from within the stone. The air around it vibrated with a low resonance, a hum that settled deep into his bones. Liam's breath faltered. His heart pounded painfully against his ribs. "Release us." The word struck him like a blow. He stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the lantern. His breath came in shallow, rapid gasps. He clutched his chest, trying to steady himself. He knew, with a dreadful certainty now, that whatever lay within the obsidian was not singular. The lake had birthed many voices, many forms, and they were beginning to converge. His thoughts snagged on the memory of that distant ripple on the lake, the shapes beneath the reflection trying to coalesce. They weren't separate entities, they were pieces of something larger, something incomplete, something that needed him. The realization sliced through him. The shard was a fragment, and the lake was gathering the rest, and Titus was forming itself from the lost echoes, the shadows of a vanished tribe, the remnants of whatever ancient power had been chained beneath Blackwood centuries ago. Liam staggered toward the door, desperate to flee, but the moment his hand brushed the knob, the whisper snapped like a whip. "Stay." His body froze, muscles locking painfully, his vision blurred at the edges. He felt water cold, oily, seeping into his mind, filling the cracks of his thoughts. The room tilted. He dropped to his knees, gasping for breath that seemed suddenly distant, and then, through the haze, emerged an image not his own. The lake at night, the moon perfectly reflected, and beneath that reflection a colossal shape, pulsing with fractured shadows, stretching tendrils upward, reaching, calling. The shard throbbed from the table, echoing that pulse. Liam's voice cracked into the silence. "No, no, please." But the whisper only softened, tender as a lullaby. "You were chosen." And deep inside him, something began to answer. Liam could not remember how long he stayed kneeling on the cabin floor, seconds, minutes, perhaps hours, because time had begun to slide around him like water around a sinking stone, losing its edges, bleeding into something indistinct and fluid. His breath rasped in uneven rhythm, each inhale frosting the air before him in a thin cloud that drifted toward the shard as if drawn by its pulse. The cabin itself seemed to shift subtly in the corners of his vision, its beams bending like the ribs of a great wooden creature expanding with each breath of the artifact. His thoughts, once sharp and analytical, now floated like debris in dark water, caught in the slow pull of something vast and patient. When he finally pushed himself upright, his legs trembled, the floor tilting beneath him in gentle waves. He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself, but the wood felt strangely soft under his fingers, pliant, pulsing faintly, like the surface of something alive. He jerked his hand away, heart hammering. He knew he had to leave, had to break the connection somehow, had to reach someone, anyone, before whatever lurked beneath the lake rose fully into the world. Yet even as the thought formed, he felt resistance inside his skull, like invisible hands smoothing the idea away, muffling it beneath layers of silt. "Not real," he whispered to himself, forcing the words through clenched teeth. "Not my thoughts." But the moment he tried to take a step toward the door, the whisper bloomed soft at first, then swelling until it filled every hollow inside him. "You cannot leave. You open the path. You must finish what has begun. The voice was layered, now dozens, hundreds of tones, blending seamlessly, rising and falling like an undertow. Liam pressed his palms against his ears, though he knew it wouldn't help. The sound came from nowhere and everywhere, resonating inside his bones. He stumbled backward, hitting the table. The wooden box quivered as though struck from within. The obsidian shard pulsed brighter, its black surface rippling with a faint internal glow like moonlight seen through deep water. Liam's breath quickened. His throat tightened with a sudden pressure, as if invisible fingers had closed gently around his windpipe, not to choke him, but to remind him that his body was no longer entirely his own. He staggered toward the window, needing air, needing proof that the world outside still obeyed natural laws. He wiped a trembling hand across the glass. Beyond it, the trees stood motionless, their branches drooping under a weight he could not see. The lake shimmered in the distance, though no light touched it. The reflection was no longer wrong, it was impossible. The sky above the lake showed dawn's muted glow creeping over the ridge, but the lake's surface reflected a full, swollen moon suspended in a pitch-black sky. Liam felt his heart twist painfully. The lake was showing him another time, or another realm entirely. And then, with slow, dreadful clarity, something moved across the surface of that reflected moon. A silhouette. No, several. Long-limbed shapes walked along the underside of the water's reflection, as if gravity bent differently there. Their forms flickered, dissolving and reforming like shadows caught in ripples, but their movement was deliberate, purposeful. They were gathering, converging. His breath hitched. One of the shapes paused, turning or folding toward him, though it had no face he could see. He felt its gaze settle on him with a weight that made his knees buckle. The whisper surged again, stronger this time, almost joyful. "We are almost whole." Liam stumbled away from the window, slamming his back against the wall. Sweat mixed with cold dew on his temples. He forced himself to think, to cling to logic the way a drowning man clings to a floating branch. The shard, the runes, the vanished tribe. They had tried to bind this thing, to keep it from merging with itself across whatever dimensional seam the lake represented. The shard had been part of a seal, a relic meant not for study but for confinement, and by touching it worse, by listening, he had weakened that seal. He needed to repair it. He needed to do what the tribe had done. But how? He knew nothing of their rituals, their language, their binding rites. The only clue lay in the runes themselves, carved into the obsidian like frozen wounds. He forced himself back to the table, grabbed the box, and stared at the shard. It pulsed beneath his gaze, the runes brightening faintly as if aware of his attention. The whisper softened, coaxing. "Use us. Join us. Become what was lost." Liam clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms. "No," he breathed. "You want me to complete you. You need a host." The air thickened around him. The lantern flame sputtered violently, shrinking into a thin, quivering sliver of blue. The shadow on the wall behind him stretched upward, elongating until it no longer resembled his own shape. Its limbs bent at unnatural angles, its head tilting slowly toward the shard. Liam's skin crawled. He grabbed the shard with both hands, ignoring the cold that shot up his arms like freezing water. The moment his skin touched it, the world folded sideways. He wasn't in the cabin. He wasn't anywhere. He floated in a vast expanse of liquid darkness, suspended between currents of shifting light. Shapes drifted around him, humanoid, but incomplete, missing limbs or faces or density, as though made from memories instead of flesh. Some brushed against him, their textures a mixture of fog and bone. He felt their hunger, their desperation, their centuries of confinement. A colossal presence stirred below, rising. The voice that had whispered to him grew louder, no longer layered but singular, immense, resonant, ancient. "You are the final echo. Come to us," Liam screamed, though no sound left his mouth. He tried to let go of the shard, but his fingers were fused to it, melted into its surface as though the obsidian had liquefied and crawled over his skin. Panic surged through him, thrashing wildly, but the darkness pressed closer, eager to fill the space inside him. Then, a flicker, a memory not his. The tribe, their final night. He saw them gathered at the shore, chanting, their voices trembling not with fear but determination. He saw their chief pressing the shard into a wooden box, inscribing runes onto the lid, whispering a plea that rippled across generations. Seal the lake, bind the echoes, choose a guardian. The guardian had been chosen then, and now another was chosen again. Liam's stomach twisted. No, he would not become the vessel this thing wanted. He forced his mind toward the runes, trying to remember every detail he'd seen carved into the stones near the north shore. Their shapes were jagged, looping, some intersecting with others like knots of energy meant to trap and redirect. He imagined those runes wrapping around the shard, around the echoing voices, around the ancient hunger beneath the water. The presence snarled, its fury vibrating through him. Do not resist. But Liam resisted, with every ounce of human will he could muster. The darkness thrashed, and the presence lunged for him, tendrils of shadow stretching into the shape of hands. He felt himself slipping mind, memories, identity dissolving like silt. He screamed silently and hurled his consciousness toward the light he'd glimpsed earlier, the faint pulse in the void center. The moment he touched it, everything ripped apart. He slammed back into his body, collapsing onto the cabin floor with the shard still clutched in his hands. Blood seeped from small cuts along his palms where the edges had bitten into him. His vision swam. The whisper had changed, now less coherent, fracturing at the edges, as though his resistance had disrupted the connection. Outside, the lake heaved, literally heaved as though something immense shifted beneath it, rising toward the surface. The reflection of the moon shattered into 1,000 trembling shards. Liam dragged himself to the window. The center of the lake bulged, water swirling into a massive whirlpool. Dark silhouettes converged beneath the surface, fusing together, limbs twisting, elongating, forming something enormous, the beginnings of a body. Antitas, assembling itself around the crack Liam had opened. His entire body shook. He had only one option left. He had to complete the seal. He had to put the shard back in the box and bury it. But not here. Not on land. It had to be confined where the tribe had confined it before, beneath the lake's silt. Liam staggered to his feet, gripping the box and shard with bloodied hands. The air pulsed around him with the entity's fury. You cannot undo us. Watch me, he whispered, voice breaking. The ground trembled as he threw open the cabin door and ran into the cold, rotting dawn. The wind carved through the trees like a blade as Liam stumbled along the narrow path toward the lake. The wooden box clutched in one hand and the obsidian shard in the other, the two objects dragging at his arms with a weight far disproportionate to their size, as though the strain came from something inside them fighting to remain in the world. The forest around him shuddered, branches trembling without wind, leaves quivering as if caught in the breath of some unseen leviathan rising beneath the earth. The sky above had dimmed to a sickly gray, though dawn should have brought at least a faint warmth. Instead, the world seemed to be receding from the sun, shrinking into the cold hush of a deeper, older night. Liam's lungs burned as he ran, each inhale sharp and metallic, tasting faintly of the lake's stagnant water. Behind him, he felt pressure building in the air, the heavy, deliberate pull of something assembling itself, something that wanted its final piece back. The whisper inside his skull crawled like ice along the walls of his mind, broken now, fragmented, its layered voices crackling into discordant tones that rose and fell in erratic waves. Stop, come back, join, become, complete. The words tangled, twisted, collapsed into each other until he could no longer distinguish command from plea. He gripped the shard tighter, and the edges bit into his skin again, thin lines of blood threading down his wrist. But pain was good. Pain was his. It reminded him that he was still himself, still separate from the reaching tendrils of the entity's hunger. He emerged from the tree line and nearly fell forward as the ground sloped sharply into the muddy shoreline. The lake lay before him like a vast wound cut into the world, its surface churning in slow spirals as if stirred by a hand miles beneath. The reflection of the moon, still hanging impossibly in that mirrored surface, had fractured further, its jagged pieces drifting apart like shards of broken porcelain. Beneath those shards, shapes twisted and merged, their elongated shadows weaving into a singular mass. Liam felt bile rise in his throat. The entity, the entitas, that the tribe had feared enough to sacrifice themselves to contain was seconds from completion. He waded forward without hesitation, boots sinking into the soft mud with wet, sucking sounds. The water lapped coldly at his ankles, then his shins, soaking quickly through fabric, numbing his skin. The cold felt intelligent somehow, as though the lake itself recognized him, remembering him from the moment he'd touched the shard. The whispers surged again, louder, but desperate. "Do not bury us. You belong to us. You are the echo we lack." Liam clenched his jaw, forcing himself deeper, water rising to his knees, then his thighs. His legs trembled with cold and fatigue, but he kept moving. Each step felt like wading through thickening tar. The weight of the shard grew heavier, pulling his arm downward toward the water. He held it away from the lake's surface, gripping the box under his other arm with a strength born only of terror. A wave rolled outward from the center of the lake, not large, but purposeful. The swelling of water that radiated from the point where the silhouettes beneath converged. Liam knew what it was. The entity was reaching, trying to draw him closer, trying to finish what it had started. He staggered and nearly fell, the cold biting into his muscles with a ferocity that felt personal, vindictive. The whisper turned sharp. "We are almost whole. Do not take yourself from us." Liam forced a breath, a broken sound that hovered between a sob and a grunt. "I'm not yours," he croaked, though he wasn't sure the words had sound. The wind swallowed them instantly, but something in the lake responded, water rippling, a tremor of fury shaking through the surface. The whirlpool at the center tightened, spinning faster, its edges rising into a low, spiraling wall. Within it, the shadows fused an arm, a spine, a mass of jointed limbs forming something immense. A body built from echoes of the tribe's lost souls, from remnants of their fear, from the hunger that had devoured them. A shape began to climb upward within the whirlpool, its edges shimmering with a strange translucence that made Liam's stomach twist. If this thing broke the surface, if it took a full form, nothing, no ritual, no sealing, no plea would stop it from crossing fully into the world. Liam knew he had seconds left. He reached the shallows where the water deepened suddenly, his boots sliding on slick stones beneath the surface. This, he realized, must have been the old ceremonial site. The ground felt carved, shaped by hands long gone. He could almost see them in his mind, the tribe gathered here centuries ago, chanting in fear and defiance as they sealed entitas beneath the silt. His breath trembled. He had to finish what they couldn't, or what they had hoped no one would ever need to finish again. He knelt in the water, its cold biting into bone, and set the wooden box down on the submerged stone slab. His hands shook violently as he reached for the lid. The whisper howled inside him, 1,000 voices shrieking in unison, enough to make black spots dance in his vision. "Do not do this." His fingers fumbled with the shard, lifting it to eye level. For a moment, just a moment, he saw his reflection in the obsidian surface. But it wasn't his face exactly. The jaw was the same, the eyes the same color, but the expression belonged to something else, something that had already claimed half of him. He froze, a horrible numbness spreading through his chest. If he hesitated now, even for a heartbeat, he knew the entity would seize full control. So, he did the only thing left he could. He slammed the shard into the box. The moment the obsidian touched the inner lining, a sound erupted not from the air, but from the water, from the earth, from the core of the lake itself. It was a roar of dissolution, a tearing cry that vibrated through every muscle in Liam's body. The water around him surged upward, forming a towering column that bent toward him like a living creature. The whirlpool behind it twisted violently, the half-formed body within it convulsing, limbs retracting, collapsing inward as though sucked back through invisible threads. Liam slammed the lid of the box shut. A blinding flash of blue-black light exploded from the cracks, slicing through the water like a blade. His ears rang with a pressure that made him gasp. He held the box with both hands, forcing it closed with every ounce of strength left in him, knowing deeply, instinctively, that if he weakened even slightly, the entity would burst free. The whisper inside him screamed, "You are ours. You cannot seal what you have already broken. Watch me," he whispered again through gritted teeth, echoing the words he'd spoken in the cabin. His bloodied hands tightened around the box. Slowly, agonizingly, the lid began to lock an invisible force, sealing it shut with a low, grinding rumble that shook the lake bed. The shadows inside the whirlpool flailed, twisting violently, as the entity's form collapsed like wet ash in wind. The water churned with its panic. Liam felt it inside his skull, clawing at the last edges of him. If you seal us, you seal yourself, he knew. He had known from the moment he understood what the tribe had done before him. A seal required a guardian. A guardian required a soul tethered to the prison. The tribe had chosen one of their own centuries ago. That guardian's presence had weakened over generations, allowing the whispers to seep out. Now it required another. Liam bowed his head, breath shaking. He pressed both palms firmly against the box, feeling the runes burn faintly beneath his skin. The water surged, threatening to swallow him. The world dimmed. The last thing he heard from the entity was not a scream, but a whisper of recognition. "Welcome," echo. The box sealed with a heavy final thud. The whirlpool collapsed instantly, the water flattening in a violent crash that splashed up to Liam's chest. The lake grew still. The reflection of the impossible moon flickered once, twice, then vanished, replaced by the true gray of dawn. The air lightened. The silence lifted. But Liam did not rise. His body sank slowly to its knees, then forward against the water, the box still clutched in his numb hands. His breath came shallow, then shallower. The cold eased not because the water warmed, but because he no longer felt its temperature. His thoughts dimmed like coals turning to ash. But he was not afraid. Somewhere deep within, a calm settled, a stillness older than words. He had become what the tribe had needed him to be, the guardian of the seal, the final echo holding Entitus down in the darkness where it belonged. As the water closed gently around him, he felt no struggle, only surrender, only purpose, only quiet. When the ranger found the box 3 days later, half buried in the lake's silt after a mild storm receded the shoreline, he assumed it was just driftwood or debris. He dug it out with a casual grunt, brushing away mud with the back of his glove. The wood was old, darker than anything should have been after years underwater. Its carvings were strange. He frowned, lifting it to eye level. A chill slid across his spine, sharp and inexplicable. He attributed it to the cold, but then something very soft, very faint, pressed against his awareness. A whisper. Not a word exactly, but a sensation, like someone murmuring underwater, far from the surface. Far, but not far enough. The ranger blinked and shook his head, clearing the thought. A moment later, he tucked the box under his arm and chewed his gum thoughtfully, turning toward the trail. The lake behind him lay still, deceptively calm. The clouds above drifted peacefully. But if he had looked back, if he had looked carefully, he might have noticed the smallest ripple near the center of the lake, as though something deep beneath had shifted, ever so slightly, in its sleep. The unseen company. The first thing Sergeant Reyes noticed was that the fog moved wrong, not drifting in gentle sheets the way mountain fog always had in his 20 years of rescue work, but curling upward from the forest floor in narrow, deliberate spirals, as though something under the earth were exhaling into the night. He stood at the ridge with his pack digging into his shoulders, boots planted in the cold mulch of rotting leaves, and watched the white coils rise between the trees with the silent patience of a ghostly audience waiting for the curtain to lift. The wind had died hours ago, which only made the movement stranger. Fog should not climb like smoke without a fire to feed it. Reyes rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the phantom warmth of a memory he tried to ignore. Trenches filled with drifting sand, the smell of gun oil, the muffled ring in his ears after an explosion. He closed his eyes briefly and exhaled slowly. This was Appalachia, not a war zone, and he was no longer the man who listened for mortar shells in the silence. He was a rescue leader now, responsible for hikers who wandered too far from the trails, not soldiers who bled into foreign soil. But tonight the forest did not feel like a workplace. It felt like a battlefield waiting for a signal. He lifted his radio to call in his team's position, thumb brushing the cold metal. The speaker crackled with static before spitting out nothing but a long, aching hiss. He turned the dial, tapped the side, tried again. More static, more silence. It wasn't the first time weather had jammed their communication, but something about the way the static pulsed, slow, rhythmic, almost like a breath, made his spine tense. He lowered the radio and glanced down the slope where the others should have been visible through the thinning underbrush. Only fog greeted him, thick enough to hide a person standing 3 feet away. He could see vague shapes moving, flashlights swinging side to side, or maybe just the fog's pale tendrils mimicking motion. "Team 1, report," he murmured, though he knew they couldn't hear him. The mountain swallowed his words instantly, wrapping them in its cold breath. Reyes adjusted the strap of his pack and began moving down the ridge, each step crunching softly on damp leaves. The air smelled of iron and decaying wood, heavy with the weight of old rainfall. He had been on these trails hundreds of times, memorized the patterns of the rocks, the dips of the earth, the way the branches arched overhead like cathedral beams. But tonight everything felt subtly misaligned, angles skewed, as if someone had taken the familiar world and twisted it half an inch to the left. He tried to stay calm. Rescue work demanded calm. Fear clouded judgment, and he'd seen too many rookies lose themselves to panic in the deep forest, where echoes and shadows played tricks on the mind. But this fog, this unnatural, creeping, breathing fog, was chipping away at his steadiness, 1 inch at a time. He reached a clearing where the earth flattened into an old logging path. The fog was thinner here, hanging low like a blanket draped across the ground. Reyes crouched, running his hand through it. The cold stung his skin with an unfamiliar sharpness, almost like frost. "Reyes to Team 1. He tried again, voice low, steady. The radio crackled, and then, just for a heartbeat, he heard something that was not static. A tone. Thin, metallic, a note that shouldn't exist. He froze, raising the radio to his ear. The tone wavered, bending into a shape that stirred a memory he had buried deep under years of discipline. A bugle call, but not a modern one. Not the short, clipped notes used by National Guard units or Ranger training drills. This was older, stretched, melancholic. A tune shaped by lips, long dead, on brass, long buried. Reyes felt the blood in his veins chill. He had heard stories about this ridge-old Civil War rumors about a battalion that vanished during a nighttime march, swallowed by fog so thick no man could see the barrel of his own rifle. Legend said their voices still echoed on certain nights, drifting through the mountains like a lost roll call. Reyes never believed in ghosts, but he believed in echoes, echoes of trauma, of memory, of violence embedded in soil that had once drunk blood. The bugle call faded. Then the radio hissed again, followed by a rough scrape. Not static, not interference, but something heavy dragging across the ground. A boot heel, a rifle butt, a canteen, something metallic, something real. A twig snapped behind him. Reyes spun, his flashlight slicing through the fog. He saw nothing, only a patch of swirling mist, coiling into a loose humanoid shape before dissipating. He swallowed hard and forced himself to breathe slowly. "Not real," he whispered under his breath. "Just fog. Just imagination. Just—" His voice trailed off, because beneath the fog, faint and unmistakable, he heard footsteps. Slow, methodical, marching in unison. They moved across the ridge with the steady rhythm of trained soldiers, boots landing in coordinated thuds that made his instincts flare with old habits. He reached instinctively for the pistol he no longer carried, a phantom gesture formed from years of military reflex. His hand landed on nothing but the nylon strap of his pack. He backed up slowly, eyes scanning the shifting white curtain around him. A murmur drifted through the fog, low voices, too many to count, men giving orders, men answering them, men whispering prayers. The language was English, but the accent was wrong, archaic, tight, clipped at the ends like something pulled from a 19th century diary. Hold the line. Steady now. Fall back to the ridge. Reyes. He froze. His name. Spoken faintly. Fading. No one alive here knew his name. Who's there? He barked, more sharply than intended, the military command leaking back into his voice like an old habit ripping free of confinement. Silence answered him for a moment. Then a voice hoarse, trembling, wrapped in static, spoke from somewhere behind him. Sergeant? Reyes turned sharply. The fog parted just enough to reveal a dim shape, a man stumbling forward, clutching his chest. Reyes recognized the voice before the face. Jones? He called out, moving toward him. Private Jones was the youngest member of his team, a wiry kid barely in his 20s who compensated for inexperience with enthusiasm. Jones staggered closer, lifting his head just enough for Reyes to see the fear in his eyes. Except, the eyes weren't right. They were unfocused. Glazed, not with shock, but with something ancient. Something borrowed. Jones's lips moved, forming words that didn't sound like him at all. You, he rasped. You should not be here. Reyes grabbed him by the shoulders. Jones, it's me. Stay with me. The young man's body trembled violently. He hears you, Jones whispered, voice cracking on the last word. Who hears me? Reyes demanded. Jones's head jerked upward suddenly, his eyes rolling white, and when he spoke again, the words came in an accent that hadn't existed for more than a century. You are the betrayer. The fog surged. 100 unseen boots slammed into the ground at once, and Reyes realized, with cold certainty, that his team had walked straight into a battlefield that had never stopped fighting. Reyes tightened his grip on Jones's shoulders, feeling the tremor that ran through the young man's body like something electric, something foreign, something trying to burrow deeper into him. The fog around them thickened in sudden pulses, each wave rolling in with the same cadence as the phantom footsteps, left, right, until it felt less like weather and more like breath, from a colossal set of lungs inhaling and exhaling around them. Reyes's instincts screamed that they needed to move, needed to regroup, needed to find the rest of the team before this thing, whatever it was, convinced them that they were part of a war that had ended a century and a half ago. Jones, Reyes said sharply, shaking him lightly. Look at me. Stay here. Stay present. You with me? Jones blinked, but his pupils didn't focus. They drifted as though tracking something only he could see. His lips quivered. General says hold the ridge, he whispered, voice cracking like an old record dragged across rusted metal. Says if we fall back, we'll be shot for desertion. Jones, listen, there's no general here, Reyes insisted, but he could hear the doubt in his own voice. Because even as he spoke, the fog behind Jones parted faintly, and through the shifting white curtain, Reyes glimpsed something impossible. Men, dozens of them emerging through the mist in ragged lines, rifles held to their shoulders, uniforms torn and mud-streaked. Their faces were pallid, features blurred by fog or time, but their movements were unmistakably coordinated. A regiment, an entire regiment moving through the forest, as though marching toward an enemy line. The bugle call drifted through the air again, distorted, stretched, as if played underwater, its notes bending unnaturally before resolving into a command Reyes's brain recognized before he could stop it. Advance. Jones jerked violently, back arching like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. They're coming, he gasped, eyes wide with something between terror and awe. Sarge, you have to choose a side. Reyes grabbed him as he nearly collapsed, but before he could steady him fully, a scream tore through the fog, a raw, gurgling cry that made Reyes's blood run cold. It wasn't Jones. It wasn't anyone he recognized. But it was close. Too close. Then another scream. And another. Panic flared in Reyes's chest, hot and disorienting. His team, they were out there somewhere, blind, disoriented, and trapped in someone else's war. Jones, Reyes snapped, shifting the kid's weight against his shoulder. We need to move. Now. We're finding the others. Jones sagged, nodding weakly. though Reyes wasn't convinced he understood. The voices in his head were louder than Reyes's voice ever could be. They began moving downhill, pushing through fog so dense it clung to their skin, finding its way into their mouths and noses like cold dust. Reyes could barely see his own boots as he forced himself forward, each step uncertain, each breath shallow with tension. The soundscape around them shifted, rifles being loaded, ramrods slamming down barrels, the sharp metallic click of flintlocks priming. These were not modern guns. These were muzzle-loaders' weapons that hadn't echoed across these mountains since Abraham Lincoln sat in the White House. A voice called out from the fog. "Sergeant?" It was faint, panicked, familiar. Reyes's heart kicked against his ribs. "Ortiz?" he called back. He tightened his grip on Jones and hurried toward the sound. Fog curled upward as he pushed through a thicket of brush, revealing a figure crouched near a fallen log. Reyes exhaled in relief. Ortiz, shaking hands, pressed to the side of his head as though trying to block something out. Reyes knelt beside him. "You all right?" Ortiz looked up, eyes red and unfocused. "They're everywhere, Sarge. I can hear them. Whole damned battalion." Reyes swallowed. "I know. Stay close. Keep your head down." Jones sank to his knees beside them, whispering something too soft for Reyes to catch, though the cadence of it sounded distinctly like prayer. Not the modern kind, but older, more desperate. Reyes forced himself to keep moving. If he let the fear take root, he would freeze. So he scanned the fog, each breath colder than the last. Somewhere deeper in the forest, another rifle cracked, followed by a grunt of pain. Reyes couldn't tell if it was real or an echo from the past. For the first time in years, he felt helpless. A leader with no map, no visibility, no sense of direction except the voices of the dead. Then he saw a flicker of movement to his left, a form darting between the trees, carrying something that glinted faintly. Reyes rose, ready to shout a warning, when the figure lunged out of the fog and crashed into him. Reyes hit the ground hard, instinctively rolling onto his side to avoid crushing Jones. The figure writhed on top of him, a man, or the outline of one, drenched in mud and fog, face twisted in a snarl. But when Reyes's flashlight beam cut across the man's features, his breath caught. The face was hollow, literally hollow. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, pale surface shaped vaguely like a human head, as if sculpted by someone who had only heard descriptions of a face and never seen one. Reyes shoved the apparition off, his pulse thundering. The figure dissolved into fog upon hitting the ground, gone in seconds. Ortiz swore loudly. Jones whispered, "They're reforming. They're remembering." Reyes didn't want to understand what that meant. Footsteps thundered nearby, heavy, deliberate, marching in formation. Reyes grabbed Jones and Ortiz and dragged them behind the fallen log just as silhouettes marched past, rifles at the ready. These figures were more complete faces, rough with grime, uniforms ragged but intact. Their boots hit the ground in perfect synchronization, a beat too perfect to belong to the living. Reyes held his breath as the soldiers marched past, their eyes unfocused, staring straight ahead. One turned its head not fully, but just enough for Reyes to see the hole where its ear should have been, the ragged tear down its cheek revealing nothing but mist inside. And yet the soldier raised a hand to its brow in what appeared to be a salute to someone behind Reyes, someone standing where no one should be. Reyes's body stiffened. Slowly, dread sinking like ice into his gut, he turned his head. Through the fog, a shape towered at the ridge, its edges faint but unmistakably authoritative, the outline of a man on horseback, though no horse could be seen, a commanding presence, a general. Reyes felt the old military instinct kick in, a reflexive stand at a tension impulse that terrified him. He forced himself to look away. "We need to move," he whispered urgently. "Now." They crawled from behind the log as the ghost regiment marched deeper into the woods. Reyes led them uphill, trying to orient himself by memory alone. But the forest had changed. Paths shifted. Fallen trees lay where they hadn't before. The mountain was rearranging itself in the fog, reshaping into the battlefield it had once been. The scream of a dying soldier echoed far too close. Jones stumbled. Reyes caught him, but the younger man's eyes were rolled back. lips moving rapidly. "Sarge," Ortiz whispered, voice shaking. "He's not here anymore. He's someone else." Jones suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Reyes' shirt with both hands. When he spoke, his voice was a stranger's, older, colder. "Traitor," Jones hissed. "You abandoned your post." Reyes shook him, trying to jolt him out of it, but Jones swung wildly, strength far beyond anything the kid possessed. His hand darted toward Reyes' belt, a reflexive reaching motion, though Reyes had no weapon for him to take. "Stand down, Jones," Reyes barked, falling back on military command voice. "That is an order." For a moment, just a flicker, Jones froze. His eyes cleared. He blinked rapidly. "Sarge," he whispered, confused. But before Reyes could answer, the fog behind Jones swirled upward, forming a hand mist shaped like fingers curling around Jones's shoulders. The young man convulsed, gasping sharply. "No, no, no." Reyes grabbed him, yanking him backward, but the fog held him fast. His eyes rolled back again, whites gleaming. "He wants me," Jones croaked, voice stretched. "He wants us all." The fog hand pulled. Jones's body twitched violently, and then he collapsed into Reyes's arms, limp but breathing. Reyes dragged him upright, heart pounding so hard it hurt. They had to get out. They had to break the loop. They had to outrun a war that refused to end. The fog deepened again, swallowing their outlines. Marching started behind them, closer now, louder, angrier. And Reyes realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that the dead soldiers weren't just replaying their final battle. They were hunting, and his team was the enemy they believed they'd been fighting for 150 years. Reyes didn't realize they were running until the world around him blurred into streaks of gray and white, the fog dragging across his cheeks like cold cloth as he hauled Jones over one shoulder and pushed Ortiz ahead with the other hand. The forest floor tilted beneath them in strange, shifting angles, roots rising where none had been seconds before, the mountain rearranging itself into trenches and ridges that did not belong to this century. The air shook with phantom rifle fire, some cracks sharp and close enough to snap twigs from branches, others muffled, distant, warped like echoes from the bottom of a well. Reyes could not tell which bullets were real and which belonged solely to ghosts, but the effect was the same. He flinched with each shot, instinctively bracing for impact. Somewhere behind them, the bugle shrieked again, but this time the note bent violently at the end, twisting into a sound that made Reyes' stomach drop, a battle cry stretched across decades. Ortiz staggered, grabbing Reyes' arm. "Sarge," he gasped, breath trembling. "They're following, look." Reyes turned just enough to glimpse shadows moving through the fog, dozens of them charging through the trees with impossible speed, their forms flickering like film frames tearing apart mid-reel. Bayonets gleamed faintly. Rifles caught the low light, but their feet didn't so much touch the ground as skim inches above it, moving with the momentum of a memory too stubborn to fade. Reyes pulled Ortiz forward. "Move. Don't look, just run." But the forest gave them no escape routes. Paths twisted violently, looping back on themselves. A fallen log appeared. But when Reyes tried to jump it, it wasn't a log, it was a barricade of stacked crates and sandbags, their textures shifting between wood and rotted canvas and long decayed cloth. His boot struck the barrier hard, sending him crashing into the mud. Jones rolled from his shoulder with a thud, groaning faintly. Reyes scrambled to his knees, grabbing him again. Ortiz struggled to climb over the barricade, but slipped, sliding back down onto the damp earth. "It's like the mountain doesn't want us to leave," Ortiz whispered, voice cracking. "No," Reyes panted, sweat freezing against his skin. "It's like it wants us to take their places." A bullet hissed past, tearing a line through the fog so close it clipped a branch above Ortiz's head. Ortiz screamed and dropped, clutching at his ear. Blood trickled between his fingers. "That one was real," he cried. "Sarge, that one was real." Reyes didn't answer. He knew too well the feeling of a live round slicing air. The sharpness, the immediacy of it. The past and present were overlapping, indistinguishable, and the dead were no longer the only ones firing. A shadow leapt from the fog, silent, weightless, and slammed into Reyes, knocking him onto his back. The figure atop him was a soldier, uniform torn to ribbons, but his face was nothing but a jagged blur of mist, features erased by time or by trauma so catastrophic it had stripped identity itself. The figure raised a bayonet formed of smoke and rust. Reyes rolled violently, grabbing for a rock anything, his fingers closing around cold metal instead. He yanked it free. A canteen. Civil War issue. He swung it hard. The figure burst apart in a cloud of fog, dissolving into tendrils that slithered back toward the tree line. Reyes scrambled to his feet, chest heaving. "They're fighting us like we're Confederates," Ortiz gasped. "Or Union, or hell. I don't know who they think we are." Reyes didn't answer. A sickening thought had rooted itself in his mind. The soldiers didn't know who the enemy was anymore. They just fought anything that moved. A rifle cracked again. This time, Ortiz gasped in pain as a thin red line opened across his upper arm, shallow but real. Reyes grabbed him. "You're okay. Keep pressure on it." Ortiz nodded shakily, but Reed could see panic racing behind his eyes. Behind them, Jones groaned, his voice shifting between himself and that other, older presence speaking through him. "General, they're advancing. Flank left. Push forward." His hands twitched violently, reaching for a weapon he did not have. His fingers curled around air as though grasping a musket. Reyes knelt beside him, gripping his face. "Jones, look at me. Stay here. Stay with me." For a moment, Jones's eyes flickered with recognition. "Sarge? Yeah, you're okay. Here with me." But then Jones convulsed, pupils dilating until they swallowed the irises. "You abandoned your men," he whispered. "Traitor." Reyes' stomach tightened. The accusation wasn't for Jones. It was for him. Someone, something, believed Reyes was responsible for the regiment's destruction, a mistaken identity, or a deliberate one. The mountain wanted his guilt, wanted his fear, wanted the war to continue. The fog thickened suddenly, rising waist-high like the surge of a frozen tide. Reyes felt the temperature plummet, the air biting through his jacket. The marching returned, a thunder of synchronized boots closing in from all directions, not just behind, but ahead, to the sides, as though encircling them. Reyes lifted his head slowly. Through the fog, silhouettes, advanced rifle barrels, bayonets, sabers raised in old drills. The ghost regiment was forming a ring around them, tightening by the second. "Sarge," Ortiz whispered. "We're surrounded." Reyes' heart pounded, cold sweat dripping down his back. He forced himself to stand, pushed Jones upright, and pulled Ortiz close. "Stay behind me," Reyes said softly. "No sudden moves." The marching grew deafening. The fog pulsed with each step. Reyes felt the pressure in the air shift. He recognized it with a veteran's instinct. This was the moment just before a charge, a memory so deeply ingrained in these soldiers that it repeated itself even in death. He couldn't let that happen again. Without thinking, Reyes reached down and grabbed a long, broken branch from the ground. Heavy, straight, wooden, a makeshift flagpole, a makeshift command signal, and he did something he hadn't done in years. He straightened his spine, planted his feet, and bellowed into the fog. The command voice returned from some deep, buried part of him. "Company, stand down." His voice cut through the fog like a crack of lightning. The marching faltered. The fog froze mid-sway. Shadows hesitated. A faint, metallic echo rippled through the air as if dozens of men had just paused mid-stride. Reyes raised the branch higher, channeling everything he'd ever learned from drill sergeants, commanders, battlefield instinct. "Hold the line." For a moment, impossibly, the regiment obeyed. The fog figures straightened into their old formations, rifles lowering slightly. Not fully, but enough. Reyes swallowed the rising panic. "We are not your enemy," he shouted. "Fall back. Fall back from the ridge." The bugle call shrieked again, distorted, dissonant, but this time it didn't signal an advance. It wavered, uncertain, like someone debating a memory. And in that hesitation, Reyes realized the truth. They didn't need an enemy. They needed a commander. The souls trapped here were obeying the last thing they remembered, following orders until the moment of death. The loop wasn't anchored to violence, it was anchored to obedience. If he could give them a new command, maybe they would listen, maybe they would break the cycle, maybe they would stop trying to kill everything alive on the ridge. He lowered the branch slightly, steady but assertive. "This battle is over," he shouted. "Stand down." The fog rippled violently, as if resisting the idea. Some of the silhouettes tightened their grip on their rifles. Others wavered like mirages. Behind him, Jones whispered, voice flickering between centuries. "General, they won't leave without the order." Reyes understood. They needed the final command, not just a stand down, not just a ceasefire. They needed dismissal from the battlefield, from the loop, from the war. Reyes inhaled sharply, lifted the branch to his shoulder like a commander raising a saber, and screamed with every ounce of breath left in him. "Company, retreat, retreat from the ridge." As to Shar, the forest held its breath, and then the silhouette shifted, rifles lowered, sabers dropped, boots turned. The entire Ghost Regiment pivoted in eerie unison and began marching back into the fog, fading step by synchronized step until the forest swallowed them whole. But Reyes didn't feel relief, because when the fog parted slightly, he saw someone still standing in front of him, a figure taller than the rest, a commander, watching him. And its lips, though ghostly and half-rotted, moved just enough to form a single word: traitor. For a few fragile seconds after the Ghost Regiment obeyed his command and withdrew into the trees, Reyes stood perfectly still, the branch trembling in his hand, shoulders heaving as he tried to pull air back into lungs that felt like they had shrunk to half their size. Ortiz clutched his bleeding arm beside him, swaying with exhaustion, whispering silent prayers into the sleeve of his jacket. Jones lay on the ground, half-conscious, his lips still twitching, with words from a century he had never lived. Words that belonged to someone else, someone who refused to release him. Reyes had expected, hoped that once the soldiers faded, the fog would thin, the forest would return to its own century, the ground would stop shifting beneath his boots. But instead, an oppressive stillness fell over the ridge, heavy as an unsentenced verdict, a silence so deep it pressed against his eardrums. The only movement was the slow, deliberate swirl of fog reforming directly in front of him. A silhouette emerged from it taller than the others, posture straight, shoulders squared in a rigid military bearing Reyes recognized instantly. A commanding officer, a figure from another war, another time, a man who had died long before Reyes drew breath and yet somehow stood before him now, as solid as any living enemy Reyes had ever faced. The shape's coat was tattered, hanging in strips of cloth that fluttered like torn flags. The insignia on the chest was smeared by centuries of decay, but Reyes could see the faint suggestion of rank officer stripes, and where a face should have been, there was only a faint impression of features half swallowed by mist. Sockets, like deep wells with no bottom, a mouth shaped by memory rather than flesh, a jawline eroded by time. It tilted its head at Reyes, studying him with an intensity so palpable that Reyes felt his pulse stutter. Then came the voice not through the air, but through the fog itself, vibrating like sound carried by water. "Traitor!" The word slithered into Reyes's thoughts, cold and certain. He swallowed hard, forcing his boots to anchor into the earth. "I'm not your enemy," he said, his voice low, steadying with effort. "I'm not part of your war. I'm trying to get my men out of here." The fog tightened, condensing closer. The figure took one slow step forward. Reyes's heartbeat hammered behind his ribs. Ortiz whispered, "Sarge, don't move." But Reyes could not look away. Something in the officer's posture, rigidity, pride, a stiff, unyielding authority, triggered a memory he hadn't intended to recall. A lieutenant he'd served under in Afghanistan, a man whose decisions had nearly cost Reyes and half their squad their lives. Orders given with confidence, consequences ignored, pretend bravery masking desperation. The memory flickered and dissolved, but the sensation lingered. This thing in the fog carried judgment, anger, and the weight of a battle that had never ended. Traitor, the figure repeated, the word now layered with other voices beneath it. Whispers, moans, accusations rising from the regiments that once followed him. Reyes forced himself to take a breath. Whatever happened here, whatever mistake you think I made, I wasn't here. I wasn't a part of your war. The fog surged violently as if in rage. The officer's outline pulsed, expanding and contracting like a lung. Its voice crashed into Reyes' skull again, louder this time, so loud he felt a sting behind his eyes. You gave the order. Reyes staggered, gripping the branch for balance. What order? He demanded, though his voice cracked on the last word. The officer raised one hand, a gesture sharp enough to slice through the fog, and pointed at Reyes' chest. The retreat. Reyes shook his head, confusion and fear battling inside him. I don't understand. But then it hit him. Hard. A horrifying clarity. When he had shouted the retreat command a few minutes earlier, the Ghost Regiment had listened, but this commander believed the retreat order was an act of betrayal. In his war, a retreat meant desertion, an unforgivable offense punishable by execution. The past hadn't interpreted the command as mercy. It had interpreted it as cowardice, as treason. Reyes' breath hitched. I wasn't your commander, he whispered. I'm not the one who abandoned you. But the fog didn't care about logic. The officer's hand curled into a fist. The fog around Reyes thickened, swirling faster, forming shapes, arms, shoulders, half-formed torsos, soldiers returning not as obedient silhouettes but as vengeful wraiths. The forest floor trembled with their fury. Jones suddenly screamed beside him, an inhuman cry that tore from both his own throat and the voice inside him. Reyes spun just as Jones was yanked backward by an unseen force, dragged across the leaves as though caught by hands reaching out of the ground itself. Reyes lunged, grabbing Jones's arm, but the fog wrapped around the young man's torso like a constricting serpent, pulling him farther. Ortiz grabbed Jones's other arm, cursing under his breath, but a sharp crack sounded like a rifle shot fired inches from Reyes' ear, and Ortiz's grip slipped as he recoiled in terror. Jones choked out a word that didn't belong to him, didn't belong to the living. Deserter. Reyes pulled harder, straining with everything he had, but Jones's body was dragged violently toward the officer's silhouette. Reyes shouted, "Let him go!" But the fog only tightened its invisible grasp. Then Jones's body lifted into the air, suspended by nothing, limbs jerking as though yanked by strings. His head snapped back, eyes rolled white, and the ancient voice inside him shrieked. He ordered us to die. Reyes's chest tightened painfully. The officer turned his hollow gaze toward Reyes again, its expression twisting into something human enough to be recognizable. Wrath. Absolute, undiluted wrath. Fog surged toward Reyes like a wave crashing through the forest. He dropped the branch and threw himself over Jones, shielding him with his own body just as the cloud hit them, cold enough to burn. Reyes gasped as the mist seeped into his clothes, searching for skin, forcing images into his mind, gun smoke thick as night, soldiers screaming as they ran uphill into cannon fire, bodies falling in heaps as officers shouted conflicting orders. He felt the chaos, the fear, the betrayal of that last night on the ridge. He saw a young officer barely older than Jones hesitating as his general barked contradictory commands. He felt the panic as the officer shouted the wrong order. Retreat, and the regiment broke formation, dissolving into confusion. In that confusion, the enemy cut them down. The officer was executed for treason. His regiment was cursed by its own rage, chained to the ridge until the general's fury burned itself out. Except it never had. The general's ghost still wanted vengeance, and now Reyes, who had unknowingly echoed that same cursed order, had become the new target. The fog snapped back, releasing him. Reyes collapsed onto the ground, gasping. Jones lay beneath him, unconscious but alive. Ortiz crouched beside them, terrified. Sarge, what the hell was that? Reyes wiped his face, though his hand trembled so violently he could barely register the movement. A memory, he whispered hoarsely. Their last memory. He turned slowly toward the figure of the general. It stood taller now, more solid, its shape growing with each second of Reyes's refusal. Its coat fluttered in a cold wind that Reyes couldn't feel on his skin. Its voice rang through the trees, no longer an echo but a command hurled with centuries of fury behind it. Stand and face your execution. Reyes exhaled sharply. No, he said. The fog tensed as though disbelief rippled through the dead. Reyes rose to his feet, shaky but resolute. You want someone to blame? Someone to punish? Fine. Look at me. The general's head tilted. Fog surged. Ortiz whispered, Sarge, don't. But Reyes stepped forward, placing himself directly in front of the furious apparition. I gave them the retreat command, Reyes said. But I'm not the coward. I'm not the traitor. I lead my men out of hell, not into it. The fog growled, an impossible sound. Reyes lifted his chin. If you want me, take me. But you leave them out of this. The silence that followed didn't feel like acceptance. It felt like something ancient deciding. Reyes didn't know whether it was courage or resignation that held his body upright as the fog gathered around him, closing in tight enough to press a cold weight against his spine. Ortiz crouched behind a fallen tree trunk, one arm wrapped around Jones's limp torso, his breathing shallow and uneven. Neither man dared call out. They knew, Reyes could feel it in the brittle silence behind him, that the moment a single sound escaped their throats, the general's wrath would turn toward them too. So Reyes kept himself between his men and the apparition, boots rooted into the churned soil of a battlefield resurrected from memory. The general stood across from him, tall as a monument, its outline sharpening into something almost human. A blue coat shredded by time, brass buttons mottled with patina, a saber hilt at its side that glowed faintly from within the fog. Its face, if it could be called that, was a blur of shadow where features tried and failed to form. But the eyes, those sunken hollows glowed with cold fire, locked onto Reyes with the fixated fury of a commander betrayed by the very soldier he trusted most. Reyes felt the accusation in his bones. Felt the mountain holding its breath. Felt the weight of 2 centuries of anger bowing the branches overhead. And yet he stepped forward. Not much, just one stride, but in that stride was all the defiance he had left. You want an execution, Reyes said, his voice steady in a way his heartbeat wasn't. Then you start with me. The fog stirred. The ghost general tilted its head, the movement sharp as a blade slicing the air. Traitor, it hissed, not through a mouth but through the wind itself, vibrating through bark, through soil, through the marrow of Reyes's bones. Reyes lifted his chin. I'm no traitor. His throat tightened but he refused to look away. And neither were they. He gestured vaguely toward the forest, toward the thousands of forgotten men whose silhouettes had marched past him. They died because someone gave the wrong order. Someone who couldn't face the enemy head-on. The fog recoiled as though slapped, rippling outward. A low moan drifted from the trees, a chorus of wounded memories rising. You blame them, Reyes continued, voice growing louder, chest rising with something fiercer than fear. You blame anyone you can reach. Anyone who echoes the command that doomed you. But you know the truth. He pointed at the apparition, jabbing his finger into the fog darkened by its presence. You know exactly who betrayed your regiment. Silence. A long, freezing silence that pressed into his lungs like ice. Then the general's saber materialized, fully this time, pulled from the fog as though drawn from the sheath of the night itself. The blade shimmered with a faint, ghostly sheen. He raised it slowly, deliberately, the tip hovering inches from Reyes's chest. Reyes swallowed, breath trembling. He could feel the cold radiating off the blade, as if the metal were forged from frostbitten moonlight rather than steel. Your order, the general said. Your voice. Your betrayal. Reyes shook his head. No, he said quietly. But I know whose voice it was. He took another step forward, close enough now that the blade nearly touched the fabric of his jacket. It was yours. The fog roared. Branches rattled overhead like bones thrown into a fire. The ground quaked beneath Reyes's boots. Ortiz pressed himself lower behind the log, shielding Jones. The general's form flickered violently, its edges blurring. Its voice fractured into multiple tones as it shrieked, Lies? Reyes didn't flinch. You know it, he said louder now, stepping into the blade instead of away. You broke formation. You panicked. You gave the retreat order that doomed your men. And you blamed everyone but yourself. The forest wailed. Fog collapsed inward, swirling violently around the general's shape. Its saber trembled. Its hollow eyes burned brighter. Reyes could feel the mountains shuddering with the force of the truth. You punished your own regiment, Reyes said, voice hoarse. You trapped them here. You trapped yourself here. And they've been reliving your mistake for 150 years. The general swung the saber upward, fury rippling through the fog like a lightning strike. Silence, it roared, but its voice cracked, splitting into pain. Your failure, Reyes shouted over the wind, not mine. The general lunged. The saber swept downward with a scream of metal that somehow pierced both air and fog. Reyes planted his feet, braced his stance, and caught the spectral officer's forearm, if fog could have a forearm, with both hands. The cold was so intense it felt like fire. His skin burned. His bones vibrated. The officer pushed, strength impossible for something weightless, forcing Reyes's knees to buckle. Reyes gritted his teeth. You want to finish your war? He growled. Then finish it. But you finish it with me, not my men. He pushed back. For a moment, just a moment, the fog's grip loosened. The general faltered, its form flickering. Reyes saw something then he hadn't expected. Fear, not of Reyes but of the truth. The truth that it had been the one to fail. The truth that it had chained its regiment for nothing. The truth that all its fury had been misdirected. And in that moment of hesitation Reyes acted. He ripped the saber from the general's grip. The fog shrieked. The trees bent as though bowing to some unseen force. Reyes lifted the spectral blade high, its weight shocking, real, almost too real. The general stumbled back, reaching out with blurring hands. No, it whispered, voice thin and unraveling. Reyes exhaled, chest heaving, and pointed the blade not at the general, but at the sky. Company, he bellowed, summoning a command voice so powerful it tore through the fog like a cannon blast. The forest trembled. Ortiz raised his head, eyes wide. Even Jones stirred faintly. Reyes inhaled. And then he screamed the one order the general had never given. The one order that could free them all. Company dismissed. Silence. Absolute. Shattering. The fog stopped moving. The general froze mid-reach. The entire mountain seemed to hold its breath. Then, like the slow exhale of a dying world, a sound rose from behind Reyes. Boots shuffling. Rifles lowering. Thousands of men sighing in relief. The silhouettes appeared, not charging, not marching, but standing. Formations dissolved. Shoulders relaxed. Hats were removed. Men looked to the sky, to the ridge, to the forest, and then, to Reyes. Their hollow eyes softened. Their outlines flickered. And they saluted him. One by one, fading like embers cooling in the dark. The general's knees buckled. His saber flickered, dissipating into mist. His form wavered. He stared at Reyes with something almost human. Sorrow, regret, gratitude twisted into one final expression. At last, he whispered, voice breaking like a crumbling monument. The order we waited for. His form crumpled inward. The fog pulled away from him. His coat dissolved. His face melted into white mist. And then he was gone, carried upward on a breeze that had not existed a second earlier. The forest brightened. The fog lifted. Jones collapsed fully into Ortiz's arms, breathing again like himself. Ortiz let out a sob and clapped a hand over his mouth. Reyes sank to his knees, exhaustion hitting him all at once. His fingertips burned where he had touched the saber. His breath shook. They sat there, 3 living men on a ridge of forgotten bones, while the mountain slowly remembered it was not a battlefield. Distant thunder rolled. Light filtered through the trees. And somewhere far above the ridge, a rescue helicopter thumped through the morning air. Hours later, back at the command post, when Reyes handed over his report, he said nothing about ghosts or generals or men made of fog. He simply noted unusual weather conditions and severe disorientation. But he kept something from the ridge. A single, deformed mini ball he found in the mud while carrying Jones down the slope. Cold as death. Warm as memory. Heavy as a man's last command. He slipped it into his pocket every morning after that, and some nights, late when the fog crept low across the valley, he swore he could hear a faint voice in the breeze. Company, dismissed. The curator's collection. The first time Ethan noticed the pattern, he wasn't looking for it. He was sitting in the cramped corner of his dorm room, surrounded by takeout boxes and half-finished articles, the glow from his laptop screen throwing a cold sheen across his tired face. It was nearly 3 in the morning, the hour when campus quieted to a hum and the city outside felt a little too large, a little too hollow. He had been combing through missing person reports, mostly out of habit, partly because he couldn't sleep, and partly because investigative journalism thrilled him in a way his assigned coursework never could. The files were endless, their details blurring together. Names without faces, dates without closure. But then his cursor hovered over one case, then another, and then a third. Something tugged at him. All 3 victims, different ages, different neighborhoods, different reasons for disappearing, had visited the same place in the days before they vanished, the St. Clair Private Archaeology Museum. Ethan frowned. He'd never heard of it. He knew the city's museums well, he'd written features about 2 of them. But St. Clair? It barely had an online presence, no proper website, just a single grainy photo on an outdated directory page. A stone building swallowed by overgrown ivy, its signage nearly illegible, its windows dark. Too odd. He leaned closer to the screen, squinting at the address. The museum was located in the Old District, a forgotten corner of the city where buildings slumped into each other like weary old men, where antique shops survived purely because no one bothered to evict them. The street was usually empty by sundown. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Something about that photograph tugged at him. The deep shadow behind the museum's glass doors, the faint hint of a display case visible through the grimy window, something vaguely humanoid inside it. He shook his head. Probably just a mannequin. Or maybe his sleep-deprived brain was conjuring shapes from noise. Still, a thrill crept through him. A pattern found in the quiet hours felt like discovery, like a secret whispered directly into his ear. He opened an incident map on his screen, dragging the cursor across city districts, tracing last-seen locations. There, another missing person 2 years ago. Same museum. And another from 8 months back. All had visited St. Clair within 1 or 2 days before disappearing. He felt his pulse quicken, a faint warmth spreading across his chest. This wasn't coincidence. If it were, someone else would have noticed by now, someone older, more experienced. But no one had. The official reports barely mentioned the museum, dismissing it as irrelevant. That bothered him even more. Ethan reached for his notebook, its pages stuffed with scribbles, timelines, and clipped news articles, and wrote at the top of a fresh page, St. Clair, missing persons dread. His pen trembled slightly, not from fear but from excitement. Every good story started like this. Something small, something overlooked, something waiting in the shadows. And the city, with its tangled streets and forgotten alleys, was full of shadows. He scanned the directory photo again. The museum's architecture was old, older than the surrounding buildings, its columns chipped, its stone facade grayed by decades of soot and neglect. And the sign, the letters spelling St. Clair, had been carved into the stone rather than painted. Permanent. Intentional. As though whoever built the place believed it would outlive the city itself. He clicked through the few photos available. The interior shots were blurry, poorly lit, but he made out glass cases, artifacts on pedestals, skeins of shadow clinging to corners where the light failed to reach. In one photo, a display case held what looked like a preserved animal skeleton, except the ribcage seemed too narrow, the skull too smooth, the limbs jointed in a way that made Ethan's skin prickle. He zoomed in until the pixels blurred. The shape didn't resolve. Instead, it warped into something closer to a crouched figure. He blinked hard and sat back. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself. "You're hallucinating." He tried to laugh it off, but the sound felt thin, artificial. The air in his room felt suddenly colder, sharper, as though the strange museum had leaked a sliver of its atmosphere through the screen. He checked the time. 3:17 a.m. The city below his window thrummed faintly, distant traffic, the occasional honk, the hum of neon signs. Ethan closed his laptop, though he hesitated before snapping it shut, catching one last glimpse of that dark display case. He stood, pacing his small room. His thoughts kept circling back to the missing names. Children, teenagers, a homeless man, a middle-aged woman walking home from work. All swallowed by the city, all last seen visiting that museum. Something inside him, curiosity or recklessness, compelled him to go. Not tonight, but soon. Very soon. He lay down on his bed, laptop still casting a faint glow across the rumpled sheets. He closed his eyes, tried to breathe, tried to sink into sleep. But the darkness behind his eyelids wasn't empty. It flickered with afterimages, blurry glass, a pale shape behind it, a room that smelled like dust and old secrets. And then, just before sleep dragged him under, he heard it. Soft, barely audible. A faint tapping. Not in his room. Not through the window. But through the memory of that photograph. A tapping from inside the display case. As though something inside had knocked, once, against the glass. He jolted awake. The room was silent except for the far-off sigh of traffic. He sat upright, rubbing his face. "Enough," he muttered. "You're sleep-drunk." But his heart wouldn't slow. Something about that single, tiny tap felt too real. Too deliberate. Too aware. Ethan opened his laptop again, slowly, almost reluctantly, and pulled up the photo. He stared at the glass case. He zoomed in. He leaned closer. The shape inside hadn't moved, but he had the uneasy sense that it had been watching him. He closed the laptop again, harder this time. He tried to convince himself he would sleep now, but he didn't. The rest of the night passed with him lying awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak of the building. By dawn he had made a decision. He was going to St. Clair. He had to see it for himself. He had to know whether the pattern was real or just the fever dream of a sleepless student grasping at shadows. The next afternoon, under a sky the color of old paper, Ethan stood in front of the museum. It was smaller in person than he expected, but somehow more imposing. The stone facade loomed over him, its pillars cracked, its carved letters weathered but still clear. St. Clair. A name carved like a gravestone. The glass doors reflected his face faintly, distorting it in the warped pain. Through the narrow slit between the curtains inside, he saw only darkness. A heavy, old kind of darkness, still, stale, as though the air inside had been trapped for decades. He reached for the door handle, but paused when he noticed something in the reflection behind him, a shape standing in the museum lobby. Still, silent, watching. He spun around. The lobby was empty. He exhaled shakily, pushing open the door as a faint metallic chime announced his arrival. The interior smelled of old dust, varnish, and something else. Something faintly organic like dried leaves or preserved specimens left too long in formaldehyde. The floorboards creaked underfoot. The display lights were dim, casting long shadows across glass cases filled with artifacts that looked older than the city itself. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. He told himself it was excitement. He told himself it wasn't fear. But as he stepped deeper into the museum, brushing dust from a placard with his thumb, a chill crawled up his spine, because behind one of the glass cases, something shifted. Only slightly. Only enough for him to doubt his own eyes. But enough to make him realize he wasn't discovering the St. Clair Museum. The museum had been waiting for him. Ethan wandered deeper into the museum, each cautious step echoing faintly across the wooden floorboards as if the building breathed in slow intervals, exhaling dust into the dim amber lighting. The exhibits were arranged with a kind of obsessive precision, each artifact perfectly centered beneath its spotlight, each placard handwritten in immaculate cursive, each glass case polished to a clarity that felt unnatural for such an old structure. The silence pressed against him like a pair of hands on his shoulders, gently guiding him down the main hall. A mannequin wearing a tribal mask loomed near a corner. Its wooden face was carved into a frozen scream, but the shadows made it seem as if the mouth twitched when he passed it. Ethan forced himself not to look back. He had been inside for less than 5 minutes, but the atmosphere already felt thick in his lungs, like walking into a basement that hadn't been opened in decades. His footsteps eventually led him to a hallway at the far end of the museum, a narrower, darker corridor that seemed less curated, less intended for public view. The lights flickered once, then steadied into a weak glow that illuminated dust motes hanging in the stale air. A small brass plaque was nailed to the wall beside an old oak door. Archive, staff only. The letters were slightly tarnished, but the edges of the plaque gleamed where fingers had touched it repeatedly, as though someone tried very hard to keep the sign clean. Ethan swallowed. His heart thudded harder. Something deep in his instincts whispered that he should turn back, write about something else, pick a different story. But another part of him, hungrier, sharper, leaned in. Patterns don't lie. He reached for the doorknob. The metal was cold. Not the usual temperature of a forgotten room. This chill felt deeper, like touching something pulled from a freezer. Ethan hesitated. Then he turned the knob. The door groaned open with a long, low sound that raised goosebumps along his forearms. A narrow stairwell descended into darkness, the walls lined with stone instead of wood. He leaned in, peering into the shadowed descent. A faint smell drifted upward, earthy, chemical, metallic, and so unfamiliar he couldn't place it. The scent made his stomach flutter with unease. He stood for a long moment, breathing slowly, trying to decide whether this was bravery or stupidity. Eventually, curiosity won. It always did. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The sound of the door latching echoed down the stone stairwell like a judge's gavel. Ethan took out his phone and swiped on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing steep stairs that spiraled downward. Small puddles of stagnant water clung to the edges of each step, shimmering faintly. Something skittered in the darkness below, a small sound, quick feet against stone. Ethan froze, breath trapped in his throat. A rat? Probably. Hopefully. He forced himself down the stairs. As he descended, the air grew colder. Not gradually, abruptly. As if the stairwell passed through an invisible line dividing the normal world from something older. The cold slid beneath his clothes, numbing his fingertips. The chemical scent intensified, now tinged with the sour sharpness of something preserved, maybe formalin, maybe something far more dangerous. Ethan covered his nose and pressed on. At the bottom of the steps, the stairwell opened into a corridor lit by a single overhead bulb that flickered in slow intervals, dying repeatedly then sputtering back to life. The corridor stretched to the left and right, but a large metal door stood directly in front of him, its surface dented and scarred. A thick chain had once wrapped around the handle, now broken, lying on the floor like a discarded snake. The padlock beside it was snapped open, the metal bent inward as though forced from the inside rather than the outside. Ethan crouched, lifting the chain slightly. The links were rusted, years old. But the break looked fresh. He stood, heart thudding. The door had a small rectangular window near the top, fogged with age. Ethan leaned closer, wiping a circle with the sleeve of his jacket. His breath hitched. Beyond the glass was only darkness. But he felt warmth brush against his cheek, as though someone had breathed from the other side. He stumbled back. His pulse hammered in his throat. He told himself he imagined it. But deep down, a part of him knew he hadn't. He grasped the metal handle, hesitated, then pushed. The door opened with a groan like an injured animal. A wave of cold air rolled out, swallowing his breath. Ethan raised his flashlight. And froze. It wasn't a storage room. It was a gallery. A hidden, forbidden gallery. Rows of enormous glass tanks lined the walls, each filled with a viscous, translucent liquid the color of pale tea. The tanks were fitted with heavy brass clasps, pipes running into the floor. Condensation fogged the glass from the inside, streaked with long, wavering trails as though something had dragged its fingers there. The faint drip 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 he'd heard earlier grew louder now, echoing from somewhere deeper in the room. Ethan stepped forward, breath caught in his chest. Inside the nearest tank he saw something floating, something vaguely shaped like a person. But distorted. Limbs too thin, spine too curved. The skin pale and mottled, half dissolved. Its head was tilted back, mouth frozen in an expression that looked dangerously like silent screaming. Ethan stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the damp floor. His flashlight trembled in his hand. He forced himself to look again, closer. The figure's hair floated like black seaweed, drifting with the thick currents. Its hands pressed lightly against the interior glass, fingers splayed. A small bubble escaped its parted lips, rising through the viscous liquid and brushing the top of the tank. Ethan's stomach lurched. This wasn't an artifact. This was a body. A preserved, contorted body. And there were dozens of them. As he swept his flashlight across the room, more tanks came into view. Some contained nearly skeletal figures, bones fused in strange angles. Others looked freshly submerged, their features still recognizable as human. One tank held what looked like a child, the small shape curled into itself, hair drifting, bow-shaped legs twisted unnaturally. Ethan's breathing hitched in a painful rhythm. These weren't archaeological specimens. They weren't medical displays. This was a graveyard masquerading as art. He approached a metal table near the center of the room, where a thick leather-bound journal lay open. The pages were cramped with meticulous handwriting, slanted, elegant, almost obsessive. Ethan leaned closer, his fingers hovering over the text. His eyes scanned a passage. The raw shape must be softened before the transformation. Fear stiffens the muscle, sorrow softens it. A good beginning is always a clean surrender. Ethan swallowed bile. He turned another page. Children are best for miniatures, their bones more flexible. Vagrants provide height, but their skin requires more chemical coaxing. Ethan stepped back, dizzy. His phone trembled in his grip. His heart raced faster. He suddenly became very aware of the silence. Too aware. The kind of silence that felt poised, listening. Then he heard it. A sound so soft he almost missed it, a faint, muffled sob, from somewhere behind him. He spun. His flashlight beam quivered across the tanks until it landed on one position slightly farther back, half hidden behind a pillar. The shape inside wasn't floating. It was upright, pressed against the glass. Hands flattened. Eyes wide open. The face was distorted by the fluid, but Ethan saw movement, tiny, trembling movement, as the figure's mouth opened and closed in slow, agonizing patterns. Alive. It was alive. Barely, but alive. Ethan stumbled backward, hitting the metal table. The journal slipped to the floor with a soft thud. The sobbing grew louder, no longer muffled, no longer ignorable. It came from more than one tank, several, scattered across the room. A chorus of silent mouths straining to speak. And then, somewhere deep in the darkness of the gallery, a floorboard creaked. Not from the tanks, not from the building settling, but from a footstep. Ethan's blood froze. He wasn't alone in the hidden gallery. Someone else was here, someone who had created all of this. And whoever they were, they had been waiting for him, longer than he knew. Ethan froze where he stood, the air inside the hidden gallery thickening around him like congealing syrup, heavy and sour and alive with a tremor he could feel through the soles of his shoes. The cry, muffled, trembling, painfully human, still quivered from the tank in the back of the room, but now it blended with a low, dragging sound from somewhere deeper in the shadows, like something heavy brushing across the floor with deliberate caution. Ethan's hand tightened around his phone, its small flashlight trembling as he swept the beam across the slick stone tiles. The reflection of the glass tanks wavered like trembling ghosts. His breath fogged faintly with each inhale, droplets gathering at the edges of his lips before falling away. A cold that didn't belong underground pressed into his spine, sinking into muscle and bone. He forced himself to move, slowly, toward the leather journal he had knocked onto the floor. It lay open, pages splayed like a wounded bird, ink spreading outward where the moisture of the room had touched it. He bent down, wincing at the sound of another faint sob, this one not from the same tank as before. Another voice. Another victim. Another life interrupted and suspended. He picked up the journal. The cover felt warm. Too warm. As though the leather hadn't quite forgotten the heat of the skin it had once belonged to. Ethan tried not to think about it, but the unease roiled in his stomach. The pages were thick, yellowed, and edged with what looked disturbingly like stitching, tiny dark threads sewn painstakingly into the margins. He flipped to the beginning where the handwriting was neater, almost hopeful. A collection is not merely a museum. It is a promise against time. Ethan swallowed. His finger trailed down the page. The living world forgets. The dead fade. But art endures. If one can capture the human form at its most honest moment, fear, surrender, stillness, one can preserve what life erases. He turned another page. The script grew smaller, more frantic. Children resist less. They understand stillness instinctively. They freeze in the presence of fear. Adults require coaxing. A promise of shelter. A hand extended in kindness. Then the needle. The wash. And finally the bath. Ethan's stomach lurched. He forced himself to read on. The solution must be adjusted with care. Too much chemical and the form bloats. Too little and the skin sours. Perfection is a narrow doorway, and only the patient may pass through it. The next pages were filled with diagrams, drawings of limbs, muscles, joints. Not anatomical sketches like a medical student might make, but designs, proportions measured with an artist's eye. Shading around the ribs. Lines indicating where bones should be subtly broken to achieve a more aesthetically pleasing curvature. Ethan's vision swam. His breath hitched. He closed the book quickly, but the next faint sob forced him to open it again, despite every instinct screaming at him to drop it and run. Near the center of the journal, taped to the page with brittle yellowed adhesive, was a photograph. Ethan hesitated, then lifted it closer to the beam of his flashlight. The picture was old, decades at least. Black and white. The image showed a man standing proudly beside a row of glass tanks much like the ones surrounding Ethan now. His posture was straight, his suit pressed, his face gaunt but smiling faintly as though sharing a private triumph with the camera. His eyes were dark, glinting with a strange mixture of pride and hunger. Beneath the photograph, in the same elegant handwriting, the curator. The first. Ethan blinked. First. He flipped the page quickly. It showed another name. The second curator. A new face. Different decade. Same hunger in the eyes. The next page held another. And another. A lineage. A legacy of obsession. Decades of men inheriting the same terrifying craft. Ethan's heart hammered. Someone still carried the title. Someone alive. Someone who knew this gallery intimately, who treated it not as an abomination but as a masterpiece. He could feel that person now in the dark. Watching. Measuring him. He stepped backward, clutching the journal to his chest, and swept the flashlight around. The beam landed on the tank in the back, the one containing the figure that had sobbed. The glass had fogged again, but Ethan saw the shape inside tilt ever so slightly as though straining toward him. He approached slowly, each step sinking with dread. The figure's hands, small hands, pressed weakly against the interior surface. Ethan swallowed hard. Through the distorted liquid, the child's face came into view, eyes half open, mouth trembling. Not dead. Not preserved. Trapped in a cruel chemical limbo, suspended between consciousness and suffocation. "Hey," Ethan whispered without thinking, voice cracking. "I see you. I see you." A tear slipped down the child's cheek, or perhaps it was condensation. A faint bubble rose past their lips. Something shifted in the corner of the room. Ethan spun, heart in his throat. The flashlight beam jittered across the floor, catching only the glint of brass clasps and the ripple of liquid inside the tanks. He forced himself to breathe. And out. Slow. Controlled. He turned back to the journal. Near the end, the handwriting changed again, more jagged, more frantic. The latest piece fights. The eyes will not stay shut. I have added a stronger solution. But art must learn obedience. Art must surrender to its own creation. Ethan's blood chilled. The latest piece. Had the curator written this recently? Hours ago? Days? Minutes? The idea clawed at his mind. Another sound. Closer. A soft tap again against glass. Then another. A different tank this time. More tapping. Weak but insistent. Shapes inside other tanks shifting as if stirred by Ethan's presence. He backed away, breath shuddering. The journal fell open in his hands to a page covered in fresh ink. What ink? His flashlight caught the sheen of it, the letters not yet dried, strokes aggressive enough to tear lightly through the paper. Read. A visitor wanders where he does not belong. But perhaps he comes not to disrupt the collection, but to complete it. Ethan's breath seized. His throat tightened. He snapped the journal shut, but a soft thump came from behind him, not from a tank, but from the darkness near the entrance of the gallery. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. Someone descending those stone stairs. Ethan's hand flew to his phone, but the touchscreen stuttered, flickering as if moisture had seeped under the glass. His flashlight dimmed, then steadied weakly. He turned toward the sound, pressing his back against a tank. Cold radiated through the glass into his spine. A silhouette appeared within the faint spill of light, a human shape slowly taking form at the bottom of the stairwell. Tall. Moving with the measured grace of someone who had never rushed a day in his life. A voice floated into the room, smooth, calm, almost warm, but threaded with something that scraped directly against Ethan's nerves. "You shouldn't be here, my boy." Ethan's lungs froze. The silhouette stepped fully into the gallery light. An older man. Hair silver, skin pale, eyes dark and bright with a collector's precision. Dressed in a tailored vest and rolled sleeves, as though he had just stepped away from a desk or a delicate experiment. His hands, large, steady, were stained faintly yellow at the fingertips. Chemical burns. Formalin. Tom. He smiled gently, almost fatherly. "I was wondering when someone inquisitive enough would follow the patterns." He glanced casually at the tanks. "At least you have good instincts. Most don't make it this far." Ethan's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. The curator stepped closer, voice softening. "You didn't come here by accident, Ethan. Curiosity is a gift. A rare gift." He paused. "But gifts must be preserved." Ethan's pulse thrashed. He clutched the journal uselessly against his chest. The curator's smile widened, kind, polite, and terribly wrong. "You see, the collection is always hungry for someone with potential." And from behind the curator, something dragged across the floor, slow, wet, and very much alive. Ethan didn't move at first because his body refused to obey him, as though the cold liquid-filled tanks around him had seeped into his bloodstream and frozen his muscles from the inside. The curator stood only a few feet away now, framed in the dim flicker of the single overhead bulb, his silver hair catching just enough of the weak light to outline his figure in an almost reverent glow. He looked like any elderly gentleman you might meet walking through a botanical garden at dusk, calm, polite, speaking with the softness of a man who loved quiet things. But there was a stillness in his posture that felt wrong, as if he were waiting not for conversation, but for the perfect moment to strike. Behind him, the dragging sound continued, a wet shuffle, as though something heavy and soft was being pulled across the floor with careful, deliberate intent. Ethan could not see what it was, and that made it worse. His mind filled the shadows with every possible horror. The curator took one small step closer, hands clasped behind his back. "You've seen far more than most," he said, voice gentle, almost proud. "Most who wander into this place flee before they ever notice the stairs. But you follow the truth. You're curious, intelligent. You understand the language of patterns." Ethan didn't answer. His throat felt glued shut. The journal in his hands suddenly weighed 10 times heavier, as though the pages themselves were demanding he accept their truth. The curator's eyes flicked to the book. A faint smile touched his lips. "Ah," he murmured. "You've met my predecessors." Ethan tightened his grip unconsciously. How long has this been going on?" The curator tilted his head, amused. "Long enough that the city no longer remembers why this place was built. Long enough that the earth above us has forgotten the screams." He stepped closer, just a half step, but enough to send adrenaline surging through Ethan's limbs. "Please," the curator continued, "don't be frightened. I don't harm those who understand the necessity of preservation." His tone remained calm, so calm that it only made Ethan's pulse accelerate. "You take people," Ethan whispered. "Children, homeless people. Anyone who won't be missed." The curator blinked as though Ethan had said something naive. "Missed?" he repeated, tasting the word. "My boy, everything in this room is missed. That is why it is here. To be preserved. To endure. To be seen." Ethan's voice trembled despite himself. "They're alive." "Of course," the curator replied lightly. "Art is never appreciated if it is merely dead matter. Life adds tension, desire, fear. And fear," he added with quiet reverence, "creates the most exquisite stillness." A hand slapped weakly against the glass inside the nearest tank. Ethan flinched. The curator didn't even look. "Do you hear their breathing?" he asked softly. "That soft fog against the glass. That is proof of persistence. Proof that beauty can survive decay when one takes the proper steps." Ethan stepped backward instinctively. The curator sighed. "Oh, Ethan, don't do that. Don't cling to your shock. All collectors know the truth sooner or later. The world forgets people. I simply refuse to." He lifted a hand and gestured toward the gallery. Ethan's flashlight beam trembled across dozens of tanks now, each revealing fragments of bodies. An arm floating limply, a face pressed into fogged glass, a leg curled unnaturally, hair like seaweed drifting in chemical currents. Some of them twitched faintly, reacting to the shift in light or sound. Some seemed to follow Ethan with the sluggish gaze of someone drowning in sleep. The curator admired them with pride. "But the living world is unkind," he said. "To waste life, discards it. I restore value." Ethan's voice cracked. "You torture them." The curator gave a small, almost sympathetic smile. "Torture? No. Transformation." He took another step, just one, and Ethan felt panic race up his spine. He backed away again, bumping into a tank. The glass vibrated, and a distorted groan gurgled from within. The curator's smile widened. "You see, even they recognize you now." "Stay back," Ethan rasped. "I don't want any trouble." "Trouble?" the curator echoed gently. "You've already created trouble. You broke the seal on this room. You disturbed the quiet." His voice lowered until it was almost a whisper. "And you woke them." Ethan glanced toward the dark corner behind the curator where the dragging sound had originated. It stopped. Total silence fell. Then something inhaled. Wetly. Raggedly. As if unused lungs were trying to expand again. Ethan's heart seized. He pressed himself harder against the tank. Liquid sloshed. A hand, ice pale, distorted by the fluid, fingers curled, pressed against the inside right behind him. He jerked forward, chest tightening. The curator watched him with fascination. "You want to run," he said softly. "But running in a place like this is very dangerous." Ethan realized too late that he had stepped closer to the narrow pathway leading deeper into the gallery. Tighter spaces. More tanks. Fewer exits. The curator's eyes glinted knowingly. "Mind your footing, Ethan. Some of the pieces are very fragile." Ethan made a desperate attempt to bolt toward the door, but the curator was faster than he looked. Much faster. He wasn't young, but he moved with a deliberate efficiency sharpened by decades of ritual. He blocked the exit with shocking ease, placing a hand against the metal doorframe. "I can't let you leave yet," he said, still polite. "Not until you understand." "Understand what?" Ethan's voice cracked. "Why you kill people?" "Kill?" The curator chuckled. "Ethan, they were fading long before they came to me. Forgotten by society. Lost in alleys and bus stations and dark corners. I simply gave them purpose." He leaned in slightly, eyes shining with a fanatic's conviction. "Do you think anyone else cared where those children slept at night? Or whether that homeless man froze behind the train station? The world has a way of burying the unwanted. I give them eternity." Ethan shook his head, nausea building. "This is wrong. You're sick." The curator's smile died. What replaced it wasn't anger. It was disappointment. Such unrefined language. "You disappoint me, Ethan. A collector must be able to see beyond the surface. The dragging sound returned, louder, closer, and Ethan's flashlight beam shook violently as he pointed it toward the shadows behind the curator. For a moment nothing moved. Then something unfurled. Slowly. Horribly. A figure crawled forward from between two tanks, skin slick, limbs twisted, eyes unfocused. A partially preserved victim who had escaped their tank, or been let out. They dragged themselves across the wet stone floor, leaving faint streaks of chemical residue in their wake. Their head lifted slightly, jaw trembling as though trying to form words. A faint gargling sob echoed from their throat. Ethan almost dropped his phone. The curator turned toward the crawling figure with a fond expression, like a father admiring a child learning to walk. "This one is very special," he said. The solution was not quite strong enough. They emerged earlier than intended. But I don't mind. Imperfection has its own charm. The figure strained toward Ethan, fingers twitching. Their eyes, though blurry and clouded, begged silently. Ethan backed away, breath tearing in and out of him. "Don't be afraid," the curator whispered. "They only reach for warmth. They remember it. Even now." Ethan's voice finally tore free. "Stay away from me." He grabbed the nearest object, a metal tray, and hurled it at the curator. It clanged loudly, skidding across the floor. The curator didn't even flinch. But the sound woke the gallery. All at once, tanks around the room began to stir. Hands fluttered weakly against glass. Faces pressed forward. Sobs grew louder. A rising chorus of muffled agony. The curator sighed, almost irritated. "You see, you're upsetting them. Noise is distressing for the fragile." Ethan turned and ran deeper into the gallery, an instinctive, panicked decision, but the only one he had. The curator laughed softly behind him, footsteps following at an unhurried pace. "Ethan, there's nowhere to go. The gallery is a circle. All paths lead back to me." Ethan sprinted past rows of tanks, breath ragged, the flashlight beam jerking wildly across warped faces drifting in yellow fluid. He reached the far end of the room, only to find another metal door. "What?" The curator's voice drifted through the dark. "Art must never escape." Ethan spun around, desperately searching for a weapon. His flashlight beam landed on a long metal rod propped against the wall, maybe part of a shelving unit. He snatched it up and held it like a spear. The curator stepped into view, still smiling, though now the smile had lost its gentleness. "Really?" he murmured. "Violence. How predictable." Behind him, the crawling figure reached Ethan's feet, clutching weakly at his ankle. Ethan yelped and kicked instinctively, knocking the figure backward. Its head struck the floor with a hollow thud. Ethan's stomach twisted, but he had no time to think. The curator stepped closer. "You could have been a curator yourself one day," he said wistfully. "You have the eye, the instinct, the hunger." He lifted something from his vest pocket, a small syringe filled with a viscous amber liquid. But even critics can be repurposed. Ethan's pulse exploded. Adrenaline surged. He rushed forward, swinging the metal rod with every ounce of strength he had. It connected with the nearest tank. Glass shattered. Fluid exploded outward. A body, half-preserved, limbs trembling, spilled onto the floor, gasping a wet, ragged breath that tore through the room like a scream. Ethan swung again, another tank shattered. Then another. Fluid flooded the floor. Bodies spilled out. Writhing. Moaning. Crying. The gallery erupted into chaos. For the first time, the curator's smile vanished entirely. "And oh," he roared, a sound so powerful it rattled the remaining glass. "Do you realize what you've done?" Ethan didn't answer. He sprinted toward the door the curator had blocked earlier, slipping on the chemical-soaked floor, nearly falling. His hands grabbed at his ankles, sleeves, legs, pleading, desperate, barely alive. The curator lunged through the chaos with surprising speed, shoving aside his own art without hesitation. "Ethan," he shouted, voice cracking with fury. "You ruined everything." Ethan hurled himself at the door. It swung open. He stumbled into the stairwell, slamming the door behind him just as the curator collided with the other side, pounding it with inhuman strength. Ethan bolted up the stairs, slipping, gasping, heart tearing itself apart with terror. Behind him, the curator screamed, not in pain, but in rage threaded with something far more chilling. Grief. "The collection is not finished." Ethan burst into the museum lobby, crashed through the front doors, and sprinted into the daylight air, lungs blazing as though he'd been trapped underground for years instead of minutes. But even as he ran, past parked cars, past street lamps, past the city he thought he understood, he swore he heard it. Behind him. Beneath the earth. through the open museum door he'd fled through, the faint sound of glass cracking, and the curator whispering, cold, breathless, furious, "Art endures." For several weeks after escaping the St. Clair Museum, Ethan moved through the city with the uneasy weight of someone who had glimpsed a truth too large for the world above ground to hold. Every sound seemed sharpened, every squeak of an elevator door, every dull thud of shoes in a hallway, every dripping faucet at night reminded him of something from the underground gallery. A trembling finger against glass, a mouth opening in a near-silent scream, the curator's calm and patient voice murmuring that beauty required surrender. He hadn't told the police everything. How could he? He had reported the kidnapped victims, the illegal preservation, the dangerous chemicals, all wrapped in careful language that wouldn't make him sound insane. But he left out the tank still whispering, the body still moving, the child whose fingers tapped the glass with the last of their strength. He certainly didn't mention the crawling figure or the curator's eyes, which gleamed with a colder hunger than any he had ever seen. The police raided the museum that same night. He saw the flashing lights from his dorm window. Officers went in wearing gas masks and gloves. They descended through the same hammered steel door into the gallery beneath. Ethan waited on the sidewalk, hands shoved into his pockets, heart thundering against his ribs with the hope, no, the desperation, that the nightmare was finally over. But when the officers emerged, their faces were pale, their expressions shaken, but not in the way Ethan had expected. They found no tanks, no bodies, no chemicals, not even the peculiar smell of the room he had nearly died in. The basement was empty, nothing but dust and old bricks. Must have been cleared out, one officer said, avoiding Ethan's eyes. Probably hours before we got here. Another muttered, or decades. Decades? Ethan repeated, panic rising. I was just down there. The officer only shrugged and wrote something in his notebook, not meeting his gaze. Ethan realized then, like ice settling into his lungs, that the curator had known the police were coming. He had dismantled the gallery, removed the tanks, hidden the victims, living or dead, somewhere no one would think to search. He had fled, carrying decades of horror with him like luggage, ready to rebuild his collection somewhere new. And he had left nothing behind but the echo of his voice, the taste of chemicals in the air, and the feeling, no, the certainty, that he wasn't finished. Ethan stopped sleeping. Nights became a blur of tossing sheets, imagined footsteps at his door, and the faint phantom smell of preservative chemicals drifting from a memory he couldn't erase. He saw the curator's silhouette reflected in dark windows. He heard the wet dragging sound from beneath floorboards even when he knew there was nothing there. He kept expecting to wake up one morning submerged in thick amber liquid, his breath fogging a curved wall of glass, the curator whispering proudly that Ethan had finally learned stillness. Days passed. Then weeks. The police eventually closed the case, claiming insufficient evidence. Students on campus moved on to other rumors, other scandals. Ethan went to class again, though he took seats near doors. He ate sporadically. He walked home only on well-lit streets. But nothing, none of it, felt the same. He had seen something that rewrote the edges of the world. Something that waited behind history. Something that hid beneath museums and alleys, collecting those society forgot about. And when he closed his eyes, he still saw the child in the tank staring at him, cleaving through layers of chemical amber. The guilty weight of that image never left him, not even when months had passed and he began convincing himself, half-truth by half-truth, that maybe the curator hadn't escaped. Maybe the old man was dead. Maybe the gallery had collapsed, taking its horrors with it. He clung to those lies like life rafts, until the morning the package arrived. It was early, barely sunrise, when a soft knock woke him. Ethan sat up, heart pounding, expecting footsteps outside his door. But when he scrambled to the peephole, no one was there. Only a small brown parcel rested on the floor, wrapped in twine. No return address. No postage. Just his name written in perfect, elegant cursive. The same cursive he had seen in the journal. Ethan's hands shook violently as he picked it up. The box was light, too light, and yet something about it felt heavy, as if it contained weightless danger. He carried it into the center of his room, set it on the desk, and stared at it without breathing. For 5 long minutes he didn't move. He considered calling the police. A friend. Anyone. But deep down he knew none of them would understand. None of them had been in that room. None had heard the curator whisper from the dark, "The collection is always hungry for someone with potential." Ethan swallowed hard and untied the twine. Inside, nestled within tissue paper, was a single photograph. Black and white. Crisp. High resolution. No. It showed a glass tank. a figure inside it, preserved, submerged. So, Ethan's throat closed. His fingers trembled violently. He lifted the photograph closer to the light. The body inside the tank was unmistakably one of the victims he had seen in the gallery, a young woman who had been curled into herself in a distant chamber, her hair drifting in a cloud behind her. But she looked different now, repositioned, straightened, softened, transformed, beautiful in the curator's terrible definition of the word. Her face had been adjusted into a tranquil expression. Her hands floated at her sides in delicate symmetry. She had become a completed piece. Beneath the photograph, written in ink so dark it bled slightly through the paper, was a single sentence. A collection is only finished when the final witness joins it. Ethan dropped the picture as though it had burned him. It fluttered to the floor. His pulse hammered so loudly he could barely hear anything else. He stumbled backward until he hit the wall, sliding down until he sat on the floor, knees pulled to his chest, eyes fixed on the discarded image. The room felt colder now, smaller, watching. Then somewhere in the hallway outside his dorm, a floorboard creaked. Slowly, deliberately. Ethan held his breath. He strained to hear. Another creak. Closer this time. A soft, patient sound, like shoes worn by someone who had walked museum halls for a very long time. Then, faintly beneath the door, a thin line of light vanished, as though someone had stepped in front of it. Ethan didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. The hallway fell silent once more. 30 seconds passed. A full minute. Finally, he forced himself to crawl across the room and lock the door with trembling fingers. The metal deadbolt clicked loudly. Too loudly. He backed away, still staring at the gap beneath the door, imagining a shadow pausing on the other side. Imagining silver hair. A gloved hand. Eyes that saw patterns in people the way others saw constellations. Hours passed. Daylight crept across his floor. Students walked up and down the hall. Laughed. Slammed doors. Life returned around him in loud, messy waves. But Ethan stayed motionless until noon, the deadbolt still holding. Eventually he picked up the photograph again. His hands shook so violently that the image rippled. He stared at the tank, at the body inside, at the perfection of it. Then he flipped the photo over. There was one more message. Smaller. Fainter. As though written by a hand that had pressed the pen gently enough to make Ethan lean in to read it. A museum closes. A curator moves. A collection continues. The ink ended in a small flourish. Ethan's breath caught when he realized the flourish wasn't decorative, it was an address. Not the museum's. Not a place he recognized. It was his address. Written in the ink. Stamped into the page. As though marking him. The curator hadn't sent him a clue. He had sent him an invitation. A claim. A promise. And that night, as Ethan lay awake in the dark, staring at the locked door, he heard it again. Soft, delicate, unmistakable, the faint tapping of a finger against glass. Not from the hallway. Not from the window. From inside his mind, where the curator had left a seed. A seed that whispered, "The collection is never finished." The night shift haunting. Marcus always hated the sound the basement lights made when they flickered awake. An electrical buzz that felt too sharp for the hour, like the building was grinding its teeth at him for daring to disturb its sleep. Midnight had barely settled over the city outside when he descended the concrete ramp to B4, the lowest level of the office complex, flashlight in hand, badge hanging crookedly from his belt. The stairwell door groaned behind him before clicking shut with a soft metallic finality, sealing him in the stale underground air that never quite warmed, no matter the season. The place always smelled faintly of dust, old coolant, and something else he could never identify, something like wet stone left too long in the dark. The hum of ventilation fans filled the wide space like a constant growl, broken only by the rhythmic buzz of the fluorescent lights, their pale glow stretching across empty parking rows and casting long shadows beneath the concrete pillars. B4 wasn't technically closed, but almost no one parked here anymore. The upper levels were newer, brighter, cleaner. B4 was where old signage went to die, where scraps of broken drywall and forgotten office desks waited to be hauled away, where Marcus spent most nights convincing himself the building didn't mind being left behind. He checked the time on his watch, 12:08 a.m. His shift had begun 8 minutes ago, and already he felt the drag of exhaustion behind his eyes. The solitude of night shifts tended to settle into his bones, weighing down his footsteps. He'd taken the job because he needed the money, because tuition didn't pay itself, because someone had to cover his mother's rent after her layoffs. But he never expected the nights to feel like this, too quiet, too wide, too aware. The air here behaved strangely, always colder near the far end of the garage, near the wall that everyone on staff called the rebuilt one. The wall that had been patched after some incident years ago, though no one could explain clearly what had happened. Structural damage, they said, but their eyes always flicked away when he pressed for details. That kind of evasiveness made Marcus uneasy. Buildings didn't hide secrets, people did. He walked the length of the garage, boots echoing in dull thuds across the concrete. He nodded at the familiar shapes, the loading bay door, the emergency exit, the old water pump humming in the corner. Everything was exactly as it had been the night before, until he reached the far end of the level and saw her again, the woman by the wall. She stood near the patched section of concrete, wearing the same pale blue button-up blouse she always did. The style reminded him of something from the 70s, wide collar, slightly too stiff, the color faded but still recognizable. Her dark hair hung straight around her shoulders, not moving even as the ventilation fans blew cold air across the garage. She faced the cracked line of newly poured cement, her hands folded in front of her, posture still and narrow as though held together by will alone. She didn't turn. She never turned. But as Marcus approached, the distant hum of the vents seemed to soften, like they were listening. He froze a few yards away. His throat tightened. "Ma'am?" he called softly because that was what protocol dictated: acknowledge, verify, assist. But protocol felt ridiculous in the face of that unmoving shape. The woman remained still. A faint whisper brushed the air, barely audible, like the scrape of fabric against concrete. Marcus's fingers tightened on his flashlight. The woman's shoulders seemed to rise with a breath she hadn't taken the night before. He swallowed. "You're not supposed to be down here," he said, forcing calm into his voice. Still no reaction. He stepped closer, stopping only when he stood at her side. Up close, the blue blouse seemed older than he'd thought, threadbare in places, stained faintly along the seams. She smelled faintly of something cold and metallic, like rainwater pooling on rusted steel. Marcus reached out a hand, hesitant, preparing to tap her shoulder gently, when she whispered again. "Promise." The word brushed the air like a breeze slipping through a cracked window. Marcus jerked back, heart pounding. The woman didn't move, didn't turn, didn't blink. Her face, when he forced himself to look, was pale, lips parted an inch, eyes unfocused and glossy as though reflecting something he couldn't see. "Promise," she repeated, barely audible, the syllables trembling with something close to sorrow. Marcus stepped away, stumbling slightly. Are you okay?" he managed, but she didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the wall, on a faint, jagged seam where the old concrete met the new, the rebuilt portion shaped like a wound that refused to heal. Marcus backed away, pulse still hammering. He didn't take his eyes off her until he reached the corner pillar. When he finally ducked behind it, he pressed his back to the cold concrete and exhaled shakily. He wiped his palms on his uniform pants. He'd seen people on night shifts before, janitors finishing late, accountants working overtime, but this was different. She didn't look like she belonged here. She didn't look like she belonged anywhere. He peered around the pillar again. The woman still stood there, staring at the wall, her lips moving in that same whisper. "Promise." Marcus stayed like that, half-hidden, until the lights flickered again overhead, breaking his trance. When he looked back, she was gone. Vanished. No footsteps. No door opening. No sound whatsoever. Just the wall, the cracked seam, and a faint cold spot in the air where she had stood. Marcus approached cautiously, scanning the floor. No footprints. He knelt down and brushed the cement with his fingertips. It felt warmer than the rest of the wall. Too warm. He finished his patrol with trembling hands and returned to the security office on the ground floor, locking the door behind him. He sat heavily in the chair and rubbed his face. "I'm stressed," he muttered. "That's all. Stressed. Long hours. Bad lighting." But even as he said it, he heard the whisper echo in his mind, soft, pleading. "Promise." The next night, Marcus returned to B4 with a knot in his stomach. He kept his flashlight pointed straight ahead, refusing to glance toward the rebuilt wall until he absolutely had to. But halfway through his patrol, he heard it again, the faint rustle of fabric behind him. He spun. The woman stood there, only a few feet away, watching him now. Her head tilted slightly, eyes wide and empty, that same blue blouse clinging to her frame. She lifted a trembling hand toward him. "Promise." Marcus stumbled backward, colliding with a parked maintenance cart. "Promise what?" he managed, breath shaking. She blinked slowly as though the motion cost her effort. Her lips parted again. "He promised." Then she vanished. Marcus stared at the empty space where she had been. The wall behind her pulsed with a faint vibration, so subtle he thought it was his imagination. He approached the cement slowly, pressed his palm against the rebuilt section. It felt warm again. Too warm. He pulled his hand back, heart racing. Something was behind that wall. Something not at peace. Something waiting. And the woman, Eleanor, though he didn't know her name yet, wasn't haunting the garage because she was lost. She was haunting it because she had been left behind. Because someone had promised to return. And never did. Marcus closed his eyes, hearing her whisper echo through the stale underground air of B4. Promise. He didn't know it yet, but she wasn't asking him for comfort. She was warning him. Begging him. Before the wall decided it needed someone new to keep its secrets. Marcus returned to B4 the next night with the same dread that coils in the stomach the moment before a bad dream returns. A familiar panic dressed in new shadows. The elevator ride down hummed monotonously, but even that sterile mechanical noise felt too loud for the kind of silence that waited below. When the doors slid open, the breath of cold underground air washed over him, carrying with it the familiar hum of the ventilation fans and the sharp, brittle flicker of the fluorescent lights, their glow stretching long across the empty rows like pale ribs inside a concrete beast. He stepped out slowly, fingers tight around the handle of his flashlight, though he didn't turn it on yet. B4 looked exactly the same. Row after row of empty parking spaces, pillars tagged with fading labels, a few old cars that seemed abandoned more than parked. But Marcus felt different. His ears seemed attuned to every shift of air, every hum of electricity, every faint vibration in the floor beneath his boots. He walked the perimeter, trying to pretend he was performing a normal patrol, telling himself the woman, Eleanor, though the name still hadn't surfaced, was nothing more than fatigue, stress. Too many night shifts in an unforgiving building. Yet even as he repeated those excuses, he knew they were hollow. Too thin. Too desperate. The whisper hadn't left him. For 24 hours it had brushed the edges of his thoughts like a cold fingertip traced behind his ear, soft but impossible to ignore. Promise. Sometimes he heard it as he walked to the bus stop. Sometimes during lunch. Once, he heard it while washing his hands and looked up to find the mirror fogging over with breath that wasn't his. He blinked and it vanished. But the feeling remained, clinging to him like static. He reached the far edge of the garage, where the temperature dropped almost instantly. The lights flickered. His footsteps echoed louder than they should have. And then he saw her. Again. The woman in the blue blouse stood facing the rebuilt wall, her posture rigid but fragile, as if holding herself together with sheer will. Her dark hair hung straight, unmoved by the circulating air. Her blouse looked older tonight, stained at the cuffs, fabric thinning near the shoulders. As Marcus approached, she did something she hadn't done before. She turned her head. Only slightly. Only enough for him to see her face in profile. But the movement nearly knocked the breath out of him. Her jaw trembled. Her eyes, pale, glassy, unfocused, slid toward him with a slowness that made his skin prickle. She didn't move her body. Only her head. Her neck stretched in a stiff, unnatural angle, like someone relearning how to use joints that had forgotten the rules. Promise. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was almost a sigh. A breath pulled from a place so deep it made Marcus shiver. He forced himself to step closer, though every instinct screamed at him to run. His voice shook. Listen. I don't know what you want. Who promised you? What promise? Her lips parted. A sound escaped, soft, shaky, almost like a sob caught on its first breath. He said he'd come back. Marcus swallowed, a knot forming in his throat. Who? He whispered, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Her gaze drifted upward toward the seam in the wall, the jagged line between old concrete and new. Her fingers lifted weakly, brushing the air near it without touching. He left me. Her voice cracked into something raw, trembling with grief soaked too long into stone. He promised he would help. Another breath. He didn't. The wall shivered. Marcus stepped back instinctively. He stared at the patched cement. A faint vibration pulsed beneath the surface, as though something inside it shifted, adjusting, listening. What happened to you? Marcus whispered. The woman's eyes returned to him. For the first time he saw something like clarity behind them, just a flicker, just a second of lucidity that cut through the fog of her paralysis. Her lips trembled. Buried, alive. Marcus nearly dropped his flashlight. The words hit him with a cold force that spread through his bones. He stared at her, at the blouse decades out of date, the pallor of someone deprived of sunlight, the faint dust on her sleeves. Understanding unfurled inside him like a slow, sick flower. They put you in the wall? He choked out. She blinked once. Slowly. He said he'd pull me out. The next breath escaped her in a tremor. But he ran. Marcus pressed his palm to his forehead, stomach twisting. The walls seemed to pulse again, a slow beat, like a giant heart coating itself in concrete. Eleanor, he whispered without intending to. The name came to him like a memory spoken through someone else's mouth. Her eyes fluttered. Yes. For a moment, just a moment, the garage felt unbearably silent, like the air itself bowed its head at the recognition. Then something new happened. A soft scrape behind Marcus. Fabric brushing concrete. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. He turned so sharply his vision blurred. But no one stood behind him. The far end of the garage was empty. He swung his flashlight wildly. Still nothing. He slowly stepped backward, until he realized the footsteps weren't behind him. They were above him. On the concrete ceiling. Soft, steady, pacing. His mouth went dry. Hello? He called, though the word felt too fragile to push into the cavernous space. The footsteps stopped. For a moment only the ventilation drones hummed overhead. Then he felt it instead of hearing it. A pressure in the air pushing downward, settling over him like invisible weight. The lights flickered. Eleanor's head tilted further. Too far. Bones shouldn't bend that way. You hear them, she whispered. They hear you. Marcus felt a chill snake down his spine. Coo, he breathed. Her eyes focused more sharply than before, two pale lanterns cutting through decades of death. The ones who stayed quiet. The ventilation fans sputtered. The lights dimmed. And in the faint hum of electricity, Marcus heard it. A second whisper. Not Eleanor's. Deeper. Hollow. Like breath drawn through crumbling plaster. Marcus, he staggered back. No. No, who said that? His voice echoed across the garage, bouncing off pillars lost to the dark. Eleanor's mouth trembled, her shoulders tightening as though she were bracing against something only she could anticipate. They know, she whispered. You see the wall. I don't want anything to do with the wall, Marcus stammered, though the truth lodged itself painfully beneath his ribs. He did see it. He saw every crack, every seam, every place where the old concrete didn't quite match the new. The wall was wrong, not architecturally but spiritually, the way a breathing thing trying to hold its organs in might look wrong. Eleanor lifted her hand, slow, trembling as though moving through thick water. She placed her palm flat against the wall. Help, she whispered. Help me keep the promise. A faint heat radiated from the concrete, pulsing against her skin. Then, a faint tapping from inside the wall responded. Marcus's legs nearly gave out. Eleanor, someone's in there? He whispered, throat closing. Her lips didn't move, but her eyes said everything. Someone always stays for the promise. Marcus backed away, nearly tripping over a loose piece of drywall on the ground. His lungs ached. His thoughts felt tight and frantic. He turned toward the stairwell door, 10 yards ahead, maybe less. If he ran fully, he could reach it in seconds. He didn't get the chance. A sudden crack split the silence, not loud but sharp enough to slice through the humming ventilation. A hairline fracture snaked down the rebuilt section of the wall. Dust sprinkled onto the floor in a thin line. The crack widened. Eleanor stepped away from the wall, her body trembling with some terrible anticipation. He's coming, she whispered. Marcus didn't know if she meant the one who built the wall, or the one buried in it, or the one who whispered his name from somewhere just beyond the concrete. He didn't wait to find out. He bolted toward the stairwell, boots pounding the floor, breath tearing through his chest. But as he neared the exit, the overhead lights cut out with a violent pop, plunging before into darkness. And in that darkness, behind him, he heard the wall breathe. Marcus didn't sleep at all after the lights died on before. He had stumbled up the stairwell in total darkness, heartbeat pounding in his ears louder than the echo of his boots on concrete, convinced that if he slowed for even a second he would feel fingers, dusty, cold, patient, closing around his ankle. When he burst through the ground-level door into the faint orange glow of the lobby lights, he clung to the metal frame, gasping as if he had run miles instead of a single flight. Even after he calmed enough to breathe normally again, he didn't go home. Couldn't. The whisper still clung to the edges of his hearing, threaded through the steady throb of blood in his temples. Promise. It followed him through the empty hallways of the office building, through the break room where vending machines buzzed like trapped insects, through the surveillance office where the security monitors flickered with their usual feed, except the camera for B4 now showed only static, dark, pulsing static. He sat at the desk, staring at that screen until dawn began to soften the edges of the monitor's glow. When relief staff arrived, they gave him a puzzled look. "Rough night?" one asked lightly. Marcus only nodded, but the expression in his eyes, hollow, haunted, stretched thin, made the other guard smile falter. He clocked out without a word. He didn't want to go home. His apartment was small and dark and too quiet. Instead, Marcus found himself walking toward the municipal records office 2 blocks away, guided by a feeling that was half instinct, half dread. Every step felt like sinking further into something he didn't want to uncover. But he couldn't stop. Not now. Not after hearing footsteps above him in B4. Not after seeing the crack form in the wall, dust drifting like the first few grains of sand from a collapsing hourglass. The records building opened at 8. Marcus waited outside for 20 minutes, hands in his pockets, ignoring the pedestrians who walked past him. When the doors unlocked, he stepped inside with the numb determination of someone bracing themselves for an answer they won't be able to live with. The clerk was a bored man in his 50s with coffee-stained fingernails and the weary posture of someone who'd been searching files longer than most people had been alive. "Accident reports?" Marcus asked quietly. The man raised an eyebrow. "What kind?" "Construction. Historical. Anything from the 70s. The clerk sighed, muttered something about young people and their fascination with old tragedies, but he led Marcus down the long aisle of metal cabinets. The smell of paper, dust, and old glue hung thickly in the air. After a few minutes of rummaging, the clerk pulled out a box and handed it over. "Be careful with these. Some are fragile." Marcus took the box to a reading table, hands trembling slightly as he opened the lid. Inside were yellowed folders, brittle around the edges. He sifted through them, heartbeat syncing with the faint rustle of old paper, an oddly familiar rhythm like the whisper that had trailed him through the garage. Folder after folder referenced minor work accidents, slipping injuries, electrical issues. He was beginning to think he'd find nothing, until he saw a file marked in red pencil. B4 Structural Incident, 1974. His stomach twisted. He opened it. The first page was dry, clinical. A report summarizing a partial structural collapse in the basement level of the soon-to-be-completed office building. According to the notes, a section of the wall had caved in during construction after a storage scaffold gave way. But buried deep in the document, Marcus noticed something off, a discrepancy in the timeline. The collapse was recorded at 2:14 a.m., but emergency personnel were not notified until almost 6. 4 hours unaccounted for. He kept reading. The next page, a list of injuries among construction workers. At the bottom, one worker missing. Eleanor Briggs. Age 29. Last seen during the late shift. Supervisor believed she may have fled the scene out of fear. Marcus's skin crawled. Eleanor. The woman in the blouse. The soft whisper in the dark. He moved on to the next file, one labeled Interview, B. Harlan. The handwriting on the page was rushed, nervous. The interviewee, Brian Harlan, a construction co-worker, claimed he saw Eleanor after the collapse, not crushed, not bleeding, but trapped, calling for help. He said she had been pinned in a pocket of broken concrete, alive, conscious, and terrified. But when Marcus scanned the rest of the report, the lines grew stranger. She kept calling my name, saying I promised, saying I'd come back. I wanted to. I swear I wanted to. But the foreman, he told us to leave it. Said the wall had to be rebuilt immediately or the whole structure would fail. Said she was already gone. But I heard her. I heard her. I'm not lying. Marcus felt the breath leave his lungs in a single, painful exhale. We sealed it. All of it. He pressed a shaking hand against his mouth. He made me. He said no one could know. Said if the higher-ups found out we left her alive inside, the project would shut down. He said we had no choice. He promised we were doing the right thing. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, trembling. But I lied. I told her I'd come back. I didn't. I left her calling my name. The last line was nearly illegible, ink blotted by what might have been tears. I can still hear her at night. Marcus shoved the folder back onto the table, his breath hitching in his throat. He leaned back in the stiff wooden chair, fingers tangled in his hair as the truth pressed down on him like the weight of the building itself. Eleanor had been buried alive inside that wall, left to suffocate in the dark, calling for help until her voice was nothing more than a scrape of breath against the concrete, calling for Brian, calling for anyone. And when no one came, when the air dwindled and the world dimmed, her promise rotted into something else. Something bound not by love but by betrayal. A terrible, lonely fury. Marcus opened the folder again with shaking hands and scanned for any notes about what happened to Brian Harlan. There was nothing. No follow-up interview. No record of him on later payrolls. He disappeared from the documents after that night. Vanished. Like he'd been swallowed by the building. Or by the promise. Marcus felt the fluorescent lights above him buzz, sharper, louder, like the ones in before. A tremor of cold prickled across the back of his neck. He turned, half expecting to see Eleanor standing behind him, blouse stained, head tilted, eyes pleading. But the room was empty except for the clerk sipping coffee at the front desk. He tried to slow his breathing, but the whisper rose again inside him. Soft, cracking at the edges, a voice pulled through decades of suffocating concrete. He promised. He knew now. She wasn't haunting because she wanted vengeance. Not only that. She was haunting because she had been left waiting. Because someone broke the last thing she clung to before the darkness took her. Marcus stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the chair. He shoved the folder back into the box, returned it to the clerk with a stiff nod, and walked outside into the sunlight. The brightness hit him like a slap. People talked, cars honked, life moved loudly around him, but none of it reached him. He felt hollow, untethered. Because Eleanor wasn't asking for justice. She was demanding resolution, and Marcus was now the only living person who had heard her story, which meant the promise had passed to him. By the time sunset bled into the sky, Marcus had already made up his mind. He returned to the office complex long before his shift began, walking straight down the ramp to B4. The air met him with the same cold breath as always, but this time he didn't hesitate. He didn't wander. He didn't tremble. He walked directly to the wall. The hairline crack was bigger now, dust scattered beneath it like ashes. The wall felt warm again, pulsing faintly beneath his palm. He stood there, staring at it, whispering softly into the dark garage. I hear you, Eleanor. For the first time, the whisper that answered didn't come from the air around him. It came from directly inside the concrete. A tiny trembling sound. A voice she hadn't used in decades. Help? Marcus stepped back, chest tightening. He closed his eyes and breathed once, steadying himself. He was going to break the wall. And he knew, deeply, instinctively, that the moment he tried, Eleanor wasn't the only one who would answer. Marcus returned to B4 long before midnight, descending the concrete ramp with the quiet certainty of someone walking willingly into a place that had already claimed a part of them. The air felt different tonight, thicker, carrying a cold that wasn't physical but emotional, the kind that seemed to bloom from memory rather than temperature. The fluorescent lights quivered above him as though afraid to fully awaken, while the ventilation fans exhaled long, uneven breaths, like a creature too tired to hide its existence anymore. The garage was empty but not silent. The concrete hummed with a low vibration that Marcus could feel through the soles of his boots, a pulse synced to something beneath the rebuilt wall. He approached it slowly, metal crowbar in hand, the weight of it strangely reassuring even though he knew deep down it wouldn't be enough. He reached the seam in the wall, the jagged line where new concrete met old, and pressed his palm against it. Too warm. Like breath pushing outward from a mouth sealed shut, he whispered, Eleanor, I'm here. At first, nothing responded. Then a faint trembling spread beneath his fingertips, subtle at first, then increasing like a heartbeat accelerating in panic. And then the whisper, her whisper, rose from inside the wall, no longer airy and distant but immediate, as though her lips were pressed against the other side of the concrete. Help! Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. I'm going to get you out. I promise. The air shuddered. The lights flickered again, dimming until the entire garage fell under a nauseating glow, shadows stretching too far, bending into shapes that didn't belong. The whisper changed, no longer pleading but warning. Don't break it. Marcus's breath hitched. I have to. You deserve to be free. No, Eleanor breathed, voice trembling uncontrollably. Not now, not alone. Her fears seeped through the concrete like cold water through cloth. But Marcus didn't stop. He raised the crowbar and jammed it into the seam, muscles straining as he pulled with everything he had. The wall groaned, a deep, resonant moan that vibrated through the parking level, sending dust drifting from the ceiling in faint gray clouds. Marcus pulled again. Harder. The crack widened by a millimeter. Almost, he gasped, bracing his foot against the concrete. Then the lights blew out. Darkness swallowed him whole. The garage fell into a silence so absolute it felt predatory. Marcus froze, breath sharp, crowbar trembling in his grip. And then, behind him, fabric rustled. Soft footsteps approached across the concrete. He spun around wildly, though he could see nothing. His pulse thundered in his ears. Eleanor, he whispered. A breath curled against his neck. Cold. Allo. Rome. Marcus, The voice wasn't hers. It was lower. Mel. Dry as though spoken by vocal cords long decayed. Marcus's skin crawled. The crowbar slipped slightly in his grip. Who's there? The footsteps circled him, slow and dragging like someone learning to walk after decades without using their legs. He backed toward the wall, heart clawing at his ribs. The voice whispered again, closer this time. You know the secret. A fingertip brushed his shoulder. Marcus jolted violently. He swung the crowbar in pure instinct. It hit nothing but air. A laugh drifted around him, soft, wet, bruised with bitterness. Eleanor told you. A presence pressed against the air to his left, heavy enough to warp the darkness. Now you must stay. Marcus felt concrete against his back. The wall pulsed once beneath him, like a held breath straining to escape. He whispered, voice shaking, Eleanor, help me. For a moment the darkness stilled. Then another whisper answered, not from behind him, not from around him, but from directly inside the concrete pressed against his spine. Run. The word was trembling, terrified, threaded with the agony of someone who had waited too long in the dark. Marcus tightened his grip on the crowbar. If he couldn't escape upward, he would break outward. He turned, jamming the metal bar into the widening seam again, ignoring the icy hands that brushed along his ribs, his arms, his neck. He pulled the crowbar with a yell. The crack deepened, another inch, then 2. Air hissed out from the opening, cold and foul, smelling of soil, iron, and something older. Something resentful. Something alive. Behind him, the dragging footsteps moved faster. The voice rose into a hoarse gargle. Promise, stay, with us. Marcus pulled again. The crowbar slipped. Fingers, impossibly long, closed around his shoulder from behind. Nails bit into his skin through the fabric of his shirt. He screamed and threw his body forward, slamming the crowbar deeper into the wall. The concrete fractured with a deafening crack. A slab broke free and fell outward, shattering on the floor. Dust and darkness poured out like breath released from lungs that had held too long. And then she appeared. Eleanor. Not as the faint, translucent figure he'd seen on previous nights. Not as the pale silhouette whispering in the cold. No, she emerged as a fully formed, half-decayed apparition, her body flickering between solid and spectral, her blouse tattered and stained from decades inside the wall. Her hair drifted around her like she was underwater, her eyes hollow with grief and rage and longing. She reached out, not for Marcus, but for the presence behind him. No, she whispered, voice cracking through the dark. He promised to help. The thing behind Marcus hissed, a wet, furious sound, and shoved him toward the gaping crack. Marcus stumbled, catching himself at the last second. Eleanor stepped between him and the unseen figure, her form wavering like flame in wind. Not him, she whispered fiercely. Not again. Marcus staggered to his feet, coughing on the dust cloud. He swung the flashlight from his belt, though he hadn't realized he still had it, and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on the figure emerging from the shadows. Or what was left of one. A man's outline, skin sunken and cracked, one side of his skull crushed inward. His clothes were ragged construction overalls stained with ancient dust. His mouth hung slightly open as though he had died mid-breath, but his eyes gleamed with a venomous desperation that froze Marcus to the spot. Brian? Marcus whispered. The figure crawled forward, twisted joints cracking, limbs dragging wrong. Its jaw trembled. I kept her, it whispered, voice rasping like stone scraped against stone. I stayed, she kept calling. Eleanor's voice rose in a wail of grief that vibrated the entire garage. You left me. The wall behind her trembled violently, cracks spider-webbing outward. Dust rained from the ceiling. Marcus stumbled back. The crowbar clattered from his hand. You left me, Eleanor repeated, voice gaining strength, echoing through the concrete pillars like thunder. You left me, alone. Brian lunged at her, more instinct than intention, and his form collided with hers in a blast of cold, spectral force that sent both flickering like torn photographs. Marcus watched in horror as Eleanor reached toward him, not to harm him, but to hold him back from the collapsing wall. You must go, she whispered. Now. I'm not leaving you, Marcus choked. You already did, she whispered sadly. All of you did. I cannot leave this place. She touched his cheek gently, and for the first time her hand felt warm. Human. Kind. But you will not stay. Behind her, Brian roared, a wretched, broken sound, and slammed his fist against the wall. The crack widened into a gaping wound. Concrete shuddered. The entire garage groaned like something enormous waking up. Eleanor turned back toward the collapsing wall, her body glowing faintly with a pale blue light. "Go," she whispered again. "I'll keep him here. I'll keep them all here." Marcus hesitated for one heartbeat, just one, but Eleanor's final whisper sealed his fate. "Don't break your promise, like he did." Her blouse glowed briefly, the last remnant of her life, before she lunged at Brian, shoving him back into the darkness behind the broken wall. The impact sent a shockwave that threw Marcus off his feet. The garage lights flickered violently, bursting one by one. Screams, dozens, maybe hundreds, echoed from inside the wall, the sound of trapped promises, broken vows, unfinished breaths. Marcus scrambled to his feet and ran, sprinting across B4 toward the stairwell as the wall behind him began to collapse. Dust engulfed the garage. The ground shook. Concrete split like bone. As he reached the door, he turned one last time. Through the swirling dust, he saw Eleanor, half solid, half light, standing in the breach, arms outstretched as though holding back a tidal wave of shadows. Her blue blouse fluttered once, then vanished into the dark. Marcus slammed through the stairwell door just as the wall caved entirely, swallowing her and Brian and the trapped dead into a cloud of suffocating silence. He ran until he reached open air. And for the first time in decades, B4 stopped breathing. Marcus didn't remember running up the stairwell. His mind had blanked out everything between the moment the wall imploded and the instant he stumbled into the night air, gulping the cold outside wind like a man surfacing after nearly drowning. He leaned against the side of the building, hands shaking uncontrollably, dust still clinging to his eyelashes and hair. His lungs burned. His legs quivered. And yet, even here above ground, the echo of the collapse, of Eleanor's final scream, of the furious roar from within the wall, of the groan of ancient concrete giving way, vibrated through him as if the building itself had carried the sound up through its bones. Police sirens eventually wailed in the distance, followed by fire trucks and emergency crews, all converging on the office complex with flashing lights that painted the parking lot in frantic red and blue. Officers asked questions Marcus barely heard, their voices muffled behind the steady throb in his ears. Structural failure? Someone asked. Gas line? Another suggested. Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. Every time he opened his mouth, he tasted dust and grief and the faintest trace of Eleanor's whisper telling him to run. Paramedics checked him for injuries and found nothing except shallow scrapes, bruises, and a shock they couldn't quantify. They tried asking if he had inhaled anything harmful, if he'd been inside during the collapse, but Marcus only nodded or shook his head without speaking. The truth strained against his ribs like something trapped inside a wall. By dawn the building was cordoned off with yellow tape, and workers began the slow, methodical inspection of the basement levels. Marcus sat on the sidewalk across the street, wrapped in an emergency blanket, watching with empty eyes. When the structural team finally emerged from B4 hours later, their faces were puzzled, not horrified, not the way they should have been. "There's no sign anyone was trapped inside," one engineer said. "The wall, it looks like it collapsed from behind, but there's no cavity. No pocket. It's just solid." Another frowned at his clipboard. "If someone had been buried in there, we'd have found bones. Tools. Something." Marcus hugged the blanket tighter around him. Solid. They thought the wall was solid. They thought nothing had existed in there at all. Eleanor. Brian. The whispers. The decades-old promise. All of it erased, wiped clean the moment the wall fell, like dust blown across concrete until it covered the truth. Yet Marcus knew, deeply, painfully, that something still moved beneath the rubble. Something still breathed. Something that hadn't been freed but only buried deeper. He quit his job that same day, handed in his badge with fingers that still trembled, and left the building without looking back. 4 weeks afterward he stayed home, curtains shut, lights on at all hours. He slept in short, fragile bursts filled with dreams of damp concrete, of blue fabric swaying in the dark, of cold fingers scraping at his arms while a whisper threaded through his thoughts. Promise. It followed him like a faint perfume trapped in the folds of a memory. He tried drowning it out with music, with television, with city noise spilling through his half-open window. Nothing worked. When he showered, steam fogged the air and he heard her voice drifting beneath the sound of running water. When he stood alone in his kitchen late at night, refrigerator humming softly, a faint tap-tap-tap echoed from the pipes, like fingernails brushing against metal. Once, as he walked across the living room, a patch of cold air pressed against his ankle like the ghost of a hand. He froze. The whisper came again, soft, trembling, unmistakable. Marcus. His breath hitched. He turned slowly, afraid he'd see Eleanor standing behind him, her blouse torn, her hair drifting like dust in a cold draft. But she wasn't there. Nothing was. Just a room. Just the ordinary silence of an apartment where no one had lived long enough to haunt it. But the air felt wrong. Too still. Too expectant. The next morning he found a smear of dusty handprints on his window, on the inside, even though he lived on the 8th floor. He scrubbed them off. They returned the next night. Fainter. Higher up on the glass. As though someone were reaching. Climbing. Searching. Marcus tried moving apartments. Tried sleeping in motels. Tried staying with friends who didn't ask enough questions. But the handprints always followed, appearing on new surfaces every few days. Faint smudges on mirror edges, dust disturbed on baseboards, patches of condensation where no human breath had been. Eleanor was gone, buried again in the collapse she protected him from. But she wasn't the only one buried in that wall. And not all spirits were gentle. Some were hungry. Some were angry. Some had been waiting longer than she had ever known. One night, weeks after he fled before, Marcus jolted awake with the sensation of someone standing at the foot of his bed. His room was dark except for the streetlight glow leaking through the curtains. He lay perfectly still, heart pounding in his throat. Slowly, carefully he lifted his head. A shape stood there, tall, crooked, barely solid, like a smear of shadow rising from the floor. The air around it rippled. Marcus couldn't see its face, but he knew. He didn't know how, but he knew. Brian. His breath rattled through the room like wind pressed through broken mortar. "You took my promise," the shape whispered, voice cracking like dried earth. Marcus's throat tightened violently. I helped her," he whispered, though the words burned. "I set her free." The shape stepped closer, the faint glow from the streetlight revealing the jagged ruin of one side of its face, crushed inward just as Marcus had seen him before. She wasn't the only one. Marcus scrambled backward until his spine hit the wall. The shape's broken hand lifted slowly, reaching, not to harm but to accuse. "You opened the wall. You woke all of us." Marcus shook his head, tears gathering. I didn't know. "Now, you do." The shadow leaned closer, its breath carrying the cold scent of concrete dust and stale air from places sunlight had never touched. "You promised to help." Marcus's voice cracked. "I can't, I'm not." But the shadow's form shifted, dissolving into the dim air, leaving behind 6 faint words that burrowed beneath his skin. "You break it, you keep it." After that night, the hauntings changed. The whispers no longer came only in Eleanor's trembling tone. They grew in number. In voices. In layers. Sometimes dozens overlapping at once. Pleading, angry, mournful, lost, all merging into a constant chorus at the edge of Marcus's hearing. Doors creaked open without wind. Lights flickered in apartments he no longer lived in. Once, while riding the bus late at night, he saw the reflection of someone sitting next to him in the window. Someone who wasn't actually there when he turned. And through everything, through every shadowed corner and waking nightmare, there was one truth Marcus couldn't escape. He wasn't being haunted by a single spirit. He was being haunted by a wall. A wall filled with the forgotten. A wall that wanted witnesses. A wall that remembered him. The final sign came quietly. On an otherwise ordinary morning, Marcus returned to his apartment after stepping out for groceries. A thin layer of dust had formed across his hardwood floor in the 30 minutes he'd been gone, and there, clear, deliberate, were footsteps leading from the front door toward his bedroom. Bare footprints, too wide and uneven to belong to any living person. Marcus stood there in the doorway, groceries falling from his hands, as the whisper slid across the back of his mind, no longer a plea, no longer sadness, but a verdict. "Help us keep the promise." Marcus left the apartment without packing a single thing. He didn't go back to work. He didn't return for his belongings. He didn't call friends or family. He simply vanished into the city, traveling from motel to motel, staying nowhere longer than a night. But the whisper always found him. In every room. In every hallway. In every quiet moment just before sleep. Weeks turned to months. Seasons shifted. And Marcus learned that a promise made to the dead does not fade. It follows. It waits. It breathes. Late one winter night, after months of running, Marcus checked into a roadside motel on the outskirts of town. He collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, exhaustion dragging him under like heavy sleep, but just before he drifted off he heard it again, soft, familiar, unbearably close. A whisper from the wall behind his bed. A woman's voice this time. "Eleanor." Gentle. Set. Grateful. But not free. "Thank you, Marcus." His breath caught. Another whisper layered behind hers, Brian's broken rasp. "You're next." Marcus stared at the wall, heart hammering in the darkness. And as the light flickered once overhead, just once, he noticed something new in the cracked paint. A faint outline. Well, fabric-like. As though something pressed from the other side. Reaching. Waiting. Calling him back into the promise he could never escape. Because once you hear the wall breathe, you belong to it. The perfect recipe. Julian had tasted thousands of dishes in his long, restless career. Soufflés airy enough to collapse under a whisper. Broths so clear they caught reflections like polished glass. Spices so subtle they felt like memories passing over the tongue. But nothing in all his years of critique had ever prepared him for the rumor that kept circling the edges of the winter dining scene like a persistent ghost. The whisper of a stew served only after midnight at a hidden restaurant called The Heart. It wasn't listed in guides. It had no website, no social accounts, no advertisements, only murmured accounts from chefs who never met each other yet spoke the same phrase in shaking voices. The perfect recipe exists there. It was not a compliment. It was a warning dressed as admiration. And Julian, a man whose entire life orbited around the pursuit of flavor, felt an itch under his skin every time he heard it. A stew that tasted too perfect, too warm, too alive. It seemed impossible. Yet here he was, walking down a deserted alley in the oldest part of the city, following a faint smell that curled through the winter air like a beckoning finger. A smell that was wrong and right at the same time, something richly savory with a bottom note of sweetness that didn't belong to any herb he knew. The building appeared out of the fog, its wooden door framed by frost-coated bricks. Above it hung a sign carved into darkened timber, The Hearth. No number, no lantern, no welcome. Only that smell, like a memory simmered too long. Julian pushed the door open. A wave of warmth rolled out, thick and aromatic, embracing him with the quiet confidence of a home-cooked meal. Inside, the restaurant glowed with low amber light. Tables of polished oak lined the narrow room. A fireplace at the far end crackled with a fire that sounded almost hushed, as though it didn't wish to disturb its patrons. Except there were none. No guests. Not a single soul occupied the chairs. Only one man stood behind the counter, a tall, slender figure with snow-white hair pulled neatly back, wearing a chef's coat black as midnight. His posture was perfect. He didn't look up right away. He stirred something in a heavy iron pot, the wooden ladle moving in slow, meditative circles. The scent rising from it curled around Julian's mind like a ribbon, coaxing him closer. "You've come early," the man finally said without turning. His voice was soft but resonant, like the low hum of a cello. Most who seek the stew arrive trembling from anticipation. You are steady. Julian cleared his throat. "I'm writing a book," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "A compendium of forgotten or obscure culinary traditions. I've been told your stew is remarkable." The man let out a faint chuckle. Remarkable is an imprecise word. Alive, some say. Haunting, others prefer. Perfect, well, that depends on who tastes it. He lifted the ladle, letting the thick liquid drip in a slow cascade back into the pot. The sound was intimate, almost indecent. "Do you wish to try it?" he asked. Julian felt his pulse quicken. "Yes," he breathed. The chef stepped aside and gestured to a counter stool. Julian sat, hands clasped to steady himself. The chef, the master as Julian would later call him in his manuscript, ladled the stew into a small ceramic bowl. The steam rose in elegant spirals, carrying with it notes Julian recognized, thymus, marrow, roasted root vegetables, but underneath was something he could neither identify nor resist, a scent with the emotional weight of déjà vu, like the feeling of remembering a childhood smell you'd forgotten until that very moment. The master set the bowl before him. "Taste," he said. Julian lifted the spoon. His hand trembled. The stew shimmered under the low light, surface gently pulsating as though stirred by a breath from within. He dipped the spoon, brought it to his lips, and tasted. The world dissolved. Warmth flooded him first, an enveloping, tender warmth that spread through his chest and down his arms like the embrace of someone he had once loved but forgotten. It tasted faintly sweet, faintly earthy, faintly salty, but balanced in a way no culinary training could achieve. It tasted like grief softened over time, like comfort wrapped around sorrow. The flavors shifted in layers, waves rolling in and out, revealing complexities that hid emotional registers rather than gustatory ones. Julian gasped softly, gripping the counter as a sudden ache welled in his throat. The stew tasted like memory, like longing, like someone's sadness distilled into broth. He blinked rapidly, trying to anchor himself. "This," he whispered hoarsely, "I've never tasted anything like this. It feels," the master finished for him, "personal." Julian nodded, breath trembling. How do you do it? The master leaned forward, eyes reflecting the fire's glow. Ingredients, he said simply. Not just flesh or bone or spice. Ingredients with stories. Ingredients with life. He lifted a small earthen jar from under the counter. It was sealed with black wax, the lid engraved with a symbol Julian didn't recognize, spiral inside a teardrop. The master loosened the wax. A faint, trembling aroma escaped, so subtle Julian almost missed it, but so potent he felt goosebumps prickle along his arms. "What is that?" he whispered. The master smiled, and something about that smile felt colder than the winter night outside. "Aroma vitae," he said softly. "A seasoning extracted from the moments that define us. Joy, despair, rage, love, fear." Julian frowned. "Extracted? From what?" The master chuckled. "Not what. Whom?" He closed the jar. "Human emotions are the purest flavor known to existence. They can be distilled, condensed, preserved. When added to a dish, they shape the flavor according to the heart it came from." He tapped the jar lightly. Tonight's stew tasted of grief softened with hope. Julian stared at the bowl, suddenly unsure whether to take another bite or flee the building. His hands shook faintly. You can't mean that literally," he said. The master tilted his head. "Why not? All food carries the imprint of those who prepare it. I simply heighten that truth." Julian pushed the bowl away, nausea flickering under his ribs even as his tongue begged for another taste. "Where do you get these emotions?" he whispered. The master studied him. "You ask many questions. Most diners simply eat and disappear into their bliss." But he smiled. "Since you are a critic, I will tell you. We select individuals whose emotions have reached their peak. A man shattered by grief. A woman in the throes of pure joy. A child trembling with fear. We take only what is necessary." Julian swallowed. "And what happens to them?" The master waved a hand dismissively. "They survive. Mostly. Emotion is a renewable resource. Though some donors require rest afterward." His smile widened, too wide. "Sit. Think. Taste again if you wish. The stew changes with every sip." Julian stood abruptly, stool scraping the floor. He had to leave. This place was wrong. The chef, this master, was wrong. He muttered something about returning tomorrow for an interview, then hurried toward the door. The master didn't stop him. He simply said, "Be careful, Julian. Curiosity is an emotion with powerful flavor. And powerful consequences." Julian left the hearth with the taste still lingering on his tongue, warm, tender, mournful. And he realized, walking into the cold night, that he wanted more. Not the flavor. Not the dish. The truth. But the truth, he would soon learn, was a recipe written in fear. And fear, according to the master, was the most potent ingredient of all. Julian did not intend to go back so soon, yet the following night, long before he finished explaining to himself why, he found his feet carrying him back down that same narrow winter alley, the one lit only by the muted glow of a single street lamp whose bulb buzzed like an insect trapped inside glass. The wind bit at his cheeks, the smell of cold metal and distant chimney smoke lingering in the air, but beneath it all, faint as the memory of a childhood kitchen, he caught it again, that impossible aroma from the hearth, drifting like a whispered invitation. His rational mind protested, insisting he needed more time, more research, more distance to evaluate what had happened the night before. But his palate, treacherous, curious, hungry, pulled him forward, whispering that some experiences could not be left half understood. And so Julian pushed open the heavy wooden door again. The warmth enveloped him instantly. The restaurant was just as empty as before, lit only by the soft amber glow of wall sconces and the low crackling of the hearth fire. The master stood at the stove as if he had never moved, stirring another pot with that same slow, mesmerizing rhythm. He didn't look surprised to see Julian. In fact, he smiled faintly, as though he had known the exact hour Julian would return. "I wondered how long your resistance would last," he said. "Most return immediately. You have more discipline than I credited you for." Julian swallowed, unsure whether to feel insulted or flattered. He took a seat at the counter again, though this time he kept his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if afraid they might betray him by reaching for the ladle. "I didn't come for more stew," he said, trying to control the quiver in his voice. "I came for answers." The master chuckled softly, swirling the ladle through the simmering broth. "Everyone comes for something they do not name. You name it though. A rare honesty." He lifted the pot lid, releasing a wave of steam that shimmered like heat haze over asphalt. Julian closed his eyes instinctively, letting the aroma wash over him. It was different from last night's stew, brighter, tinged with something sharp, something like citrus but darker, deeper, as though fermented in sorrow and bottled in hope. The smell hit his chest like a childhood grief he'd never fully unpacked. "Stop," Julian whispered. "Just stop using that on me." The lid shut. The master's footsteps echoed softly as he approached, folding his hands behind his back. "You are sensitive," he observed. "Not just to flavor but to meaning. You felt the story in the broth last night. That is why you're here. It tasted alive to you because it was." Julian flinched. "I don't accept that. I don't believe emotions can be cooked into food." "No," the master corrected gently. "They cannot be cooked, but they can be captured, distilled, bottled." He reached beneath the counter and lifted a small wooden tray containing 3 jars, each sealed with wax of a different color. One red, one blue, one pale yellow. Symbols were carved into each lid, not letters or numbers but shapes reminiscent of human faces simplified into emotions. A droplet, a spiral, an open mouth. The master tapped the red jar with a fingertip. "This one is fear." He tapped the blue. "This is grief." Then the pale yellow. Elation. Julian leaned forward despite himself, throat tightening. "You said yesterday they were harvested from people, in emotional extremes." "Harvested is an ugly word," the master murmured, "but accurate." He lifted the red jar, holding it delicately, almost reverently. Emotions reach their purest form in the moments when the heart is stripped bare. Joy at its summit, sorrow at its depth, fear at its breaking point. His smile sharpened. "And we collect them." Julian stared at the jar, so small, so unassuming, and felt something ancient inside him recoil. "How?" he whispered. The master set the jar down with a soft click. "Through a process my order has refined over centuries. Human emotion, when pushed to its threshold, releases energy, chemical, psychological, spiritual, depending on your beliefs." He gestured around the room. "Aroma vitae is the essence of that release. We distill it, preserve it, and use it to create dishes capable of reaching the deepest part of the human palate, the soul." Julian felt cold despite the heart's warmth. "And the donors? What happens to them?" The master's expression didn't change, but a shadow flickered behind his eyes. "Some sleep, some forget, some are no longer needed." Julian stood abruptly. "This is wrong. This is monstrous." But even as the word left his mouth, the aroma from the pot tugged at him, whispering that the world was larger, stranger, and more intoxicating than he had allowed himself to believe. The master watched him, calm as ever. "Everything extraordinary requires sacrifice, Julian. Every chef knows this." He stepped closer. "You've sacrificed relationships. Tom. You've bled for your craft in your own way." Julian opened his mouth to protest, but the master continued. "Ours is not so different. We simply elevate what is already true. Humans suffer. Humans feel. We give their emotions purpose beyond pain." Julian shook his head and turned away, but the master's voice followed him like smoke. "Tell me, Julian, how did that stew taste last night? Not physically. Emotionally." Julian froze. The answer formed before he could stop it. "It tasted like losing someone," he whispered. "Like the sadness you feel the morning after a funeral, when the world is too quiet but not cruel." "Exactly." The master smiled. "Because the donor was a widower who came to us with a heart already cracked open. His grief was perfect." Julian shuddered while rising in his throat. "You're insane." "No," the master said softly. "I am a curator of flavor." He gestured toward the pot. "Taste again if you dare. Tonight's stew carries the notes of anticipation, the purest form of hope." Julian hesitated. His hand trembled toward the ladle, then withdrew sharply. "I can't." "But you want to," the master whispered. "Curiosity is your defining flavor. Season your life. It brought you here." He leaned in slightly, voice lowering. "And it will bring you back even if you flee tonight. Because once you have tasted what a soul feels like, ordinary food becomes unbearably silent." Julian forced himself to step back, away from the counter. "I'm leaving." The master didn't move. "Of course. But before you go, let me offer advice." His tone softened into something almost fatherly. "Do not seek the cold room. Do not look for what is not offered." Julian's heart lurched. "Cold room?" The master's eyes glinted. "Every restaurant has storage." "What are you storing?" Julian whispered. "Emotion," the master replied. in all its raw forms. Julian turned away, shaking, and backed toward the exit. His fingers brushed the door handle. The master called softly after him, "Be careful, Julian. Curiosity is an emotion too, and we have not yet bottled yours." The door closed behind him. The winter air struck him hard. But even as he walked away, Julian's pulse throbbed with that impossible aroma, warmth lingering on his tongue like an unfinished story. He would not sleep that night. He knew it even before he reached home, because behind every perfect flavor lies a secret. And Julian had tasted enough to know he needed the rest. Even if it ruined him, Julian told himself he wouldn't go back. He repeated it on the walk home, under hot shower water, while lying awake in the dark listening to the winter wind scrape along his window. "I won't go back. I won't go back." But sometime near dawn, just as sleep finally tugged him under, he tasted it again. Not in his mouth, but in the back of his memory, that impossible stew, its warmth blooming across his tongue like a secret meant only for him. He jolted awake, pulse racing, heart hammering in rhythm with something deeper than hunger. And he knew. He would go back. Not to eat. Not to indulge. To investigate. To pull apart the threads of the story the master had woven so elegantly around him. Curiosity, after all, was the sharpest knife he owned. He waited 2 days. He wanted the appearance of restraint. But on the third night, shortly after midnight, Julian returned to the alley behind the hearth, this time approaching from the back, where a narrow service path slipped between 2-century-old brick buildings. Snow piled in uneven drifts along the ground, softening the edges of dumpsters and wooden crates. The back door of the hearth bore no signage, only a metal latch and a faint glow bleeding through its frame. Julian tested the handle. What? But the old wooden window beside it rattled slightly in the wind, its warped frame offering just enough give for determined fingers. He pressed upward with the heel of his palm, felt the brittle wood crack, and lifted the pane until it shuddered open wide enough for him to slip inside. The kitchen was dark except for a single pilot light flickering under one of the stoves, casting a faint orange glow that made shadows behave strangely, stretching long across counters, pulling themselves thin like tired silhouettes. The smell hit him first, not the comforting aroma of stew he remembered, but something colder, rawer, a scent like iron wrapped in frost. He waited, heart thudding, until his eyes adjusted. Stainless steel counters glimmered faintly. Hanging pots clinked softly in the draft. A row of chopped vegetables lay half prepared, as if abandoned mid-shift. But the room was silent. Too silent. Even the building seemed to hold its breath. Julian moved softly across the tiled floor, careful not to disturb any utensils. He scanned the kitchen for hidden doors, remembering the master's warning, "Do not seek the cold room," which of course only made Julian seek it harder. He found it tucked behind a woven curtain near the pantry, a heavy metal door, freezer grate with a frost-coated wheel lock. No signage. No handle on the outside. Only a faint trail of condensation that dripped onto the floor like tears. Julian touched the wheel. Ice bit into his skin. It turned too easily, like something, wanted it to open. His breath clouded in front of him as he pushed the door inward. Cold air rushed out, swallowing him in a fog of frost and metallic tang. He stepped inside, pulling the door halfway shut behind him, leaving it ajar. The room hummed with the low monotone of an industrial cooling unit. The temperature dropped fast, seeping into his bones. Shelves lined the walls, each one filled with vacuum-sealed bags. Clear, perfectly organized, each labeled not with names but with emotions. Grief, pure joy, terror, resentment, bliss, anger, first love, last regret. Each bag contained something pale and vaguely organic, too abstract to identify, too recognizable to ignore. Some pulsed faintly with residual warmth. Others looked frozen solid, their surfaces dusted with crystallized frost. Julian felt bow crawl up his throat. "My God," he whispered. His breath fogged the nearest shelf. He reached toward a bag labeled fear, fingers shaking uncontrollably. The contents inside twitched. Just once. A tiny contraction, as though reacting to his nearness. Julian yanked his hand back, heart pounding so hard he felt lightheaded. He stumbled deeper into the room, unable to tear his eyes away. At the far end stood a butcher's table, its wooden surface scarred with knife marks. Above it hung hooks, empty now but swaying faintly as though recently disturbed, and beside the table lay a small journal, bound in leather, its cover stained with something darkened by time. Julian picked it up with trembling hands, flipping to the first page. "We do not kill. We cultivate. We distill emotion at its peak when the soul is loudest." Some require coaxing. Some require breaking. But all must feel deeply before the harvest. Julian's vision blurred with horror. He read another line. Fear is strongest when the donor believes they may survive. Hope is sweetest just before it is crushed. Bliss is purest when it knows nothing of the knife. He slammed the journal shut, breath shuddering. Footsteps echoed faintly outside the cold room. Soft, measured, deliberate. The master was here. Julian panicked, searching for a place to hide, but the room was too small, too barren. No corners. No shadows deep enough to swallow him. The cold unit's hum grew louder, as though sensing his fear and savoring it. He backed toward the shelves, slipping between racks of frozen emotions, pressing himself against the cold metal frame. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped right outside the door. A whisper leaked through the crack. Curiosity, the master murmured, is an emotion we rarely have the pleasure of harvesting whole. Julian's stomach dropped. The door creaked open, not slowly, not dramatically, but with the casual confidence of a man who knew exactly where his prey was standing. The master stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His breath did not fog in the cold. His eyes gleamed with something ancient. You were told not to seek this room, he said gently, as if scolding a child. Julian said nothing. His teeth chattered. The master walked between the shelves, trailing a gloved fingertip along one of the labeled bags. This room contains the ingredients for greatness, he continued. The flavors that transform ordinary meals into revelations. He stopped beside Julian's row without looking at him. There is no shame in wanting to understand. Curiosity is a noble hunger. Julian forced his voice to work. This is wrong. You can't harvest people like crops. The master turned his head, expression unreadable. We do not harm them. We simply guide their emotions until they bloom. Bloom? Julian spat. You torture them. The master's eyes softened. Torture is careless, wasteful. We craft. We conduct. We listen to their hearts until they sing. Julian stepped away from the shelf, but the master blocked his path with ease, moving with an elegance that made Julian's blood run colder than the freezer air. Why me? Julian whispered. Why let me in at all? The master tilted his head. Because your palate is extraordinary. Your sensitivity rare. You tasted the donor's grief with clarity most chefs take decades to reach. He moved closer, voice low. And because you already carry an emotion we desperately need. Julian inhaled sharply. What emotion? The master smiled, placing a hand on Julian's shoulder. Fear beginning to blossom into panic. It is the most delicate stage, the most flavorful. Julian shoved him away and sprinted toward the door, but the master did not chase him. Instead he sighed. Running, Julian? That too is an emotion we can use. Julian grabbed the wheel lock, fingers numb from cold, twisting frantically. The door didn't budge. His breath grew shallow. The master approached slowly, clasping his hands behind his back, like a lecturer strolling toward a chalkboard. You entered willingly, he said. This room binds itself to those who seek its secrets. A kitchen is a living creature, Julian. It knows when a new ingredient has arrived. Julian spun around, panting, back pressed to the metal door. What do you want from me? The master's smile widened. To season you. Julian lunged for the shelves, knocking down bags indiscriminately, letting emotions spill across the floor like thawing organs. Plastic burst. Frozen bits skidded across the tile. The air filled with an unholy mixture of scents, grief, rage, lust, terror, creating a sense so violently emotional that Julian gagged. The cold room trembled. The master's expression darkened with disappointment. You are ruining years of work, he said quietly. But destruction is also a flavor. He stepped forward. Julian grabbed the nearest object, a steel ladle, and swung wildly. It struck the side of a shelf with a metallic clang that echoed through the room. The master moved like a shadow, faster than seemed possible, pinning Julian's wrist against the metal. You are trembling beautifully, he whispered. Julian roared and headbutted him out of pure instinct. Pain exploded behind his eyes, but the master staggered backward, releasing him. Julian didn't wait. He rammed his shoulder into the wheel lock. Once, twice, and on the third hit, the frozen latch cracked just enough for the door to budge. He shoved it open and tumbled into the kitchen. He didn't look back. He didn't breathe. He just ran. Behind him, the master's voice floated through the cold air like steam rising from broth. Fear will season itself, Julian, and I will be waiting for the moment it reaches perfection. Julian didn't remember how long he ran, only the sound of his boots slipping across tile, the hot sting of the freezer's air still clinging to his throat, and the steady, terrible rhythm of his heart beating out the shape of a terror he'd never known before. The kitchen lights flickered from the shock of the freezer door slamming open. Pots trembled on their hooks, and the low simmer of something forgotten on the stove filled the room with a scent so rich it clung to the back of Julian's tongue like steam from a fever dream. He stumbled, caught himself on a counter, and finally forced his legs to stop moving. His breath came in ragged bursts. His hands shook so badly he could barely lift them to wipe the cold sweat from his face. But he wasn't alone. He felt that before he heard it, felt the shift in the air, the subtle warm exhale behind him, the presence of something patient and hungry filling the space like a pressure drop before a storm. Running only tenderizes the emotion, the master said softly. Julian spun around. The master stood in the center of the kitchen as though he'd been waiting there all along. His black chef's coat was immaculate despite the chaos inside the cold room. His silver hair was still perfectly tied. But something in his expression had changed. There was no warmth left. No pretense of hospitality. Only hunger. "I warned you not to seek the cold room," he said gently. "But of course you did. Curiosity is the seasoning of fools and visionaries." Julian backed away, searching the countertops for a knife, a pan, anything with weight. "Stay away from me." The master stepped forward. "You misunderstand, Julian. I don't intend to hurt you." His smile broadened. "I intend to use you." Julian felt the counter press against his lower back. No more room to retreat. The master lifted one hand, palm upward, as though offering something invisible. The air thickened, and Julian felt it like a cold finger dragging through the center of his mind. His fear swelled, sharpened, intensified until it burned the inside of his ribs like acid. He gasped, clutching the counter for balance. The master's voice dropped to a reverent whisper. "Yes, that's it." Fear awakened. Fear ripening. He stepped closer, eyes half-lidded in a kind of ecstatic concentration. "Ultimate fear," he murmured, "is the richest of all emotions. It distills like honey, but only in the final moment before the heart breaks." Julian felt something pulling inside him. His thoughts tightening, his breath shortening, his instincts screaming that he was prey being pushed toward a single perfect emotional crescendo. His vision warbled at the edges. Panic clawed at his throat. "Stop," he gasped. The master leaned close enough for Julian to smell faint traces of saffron and smoke clinging to his skin. "We will take your fear," he whispered, "just as you reach the moment of complete surrender. Then we will season the world with it." Julian's chest tightened. His pulse raced, his legs weakened. He could feel himself being pulled toward the exact emotion the master wanted, terror so distilled it tasted like purity. He saw flashes of himself in some ritual, a bag of vacuum-sealed essence labeled Ultimate Fear, stored beside the others. He saw diners tasting his fear and moaning at its depth, its perfect balance, its heartbreaking clarity. He saw his life reduced to a flavor, his legacy bottled like spice. No, something snapped in him. Not fear, not panic, something hotter, something sharper, something that clawed upward with the fury of a wounded animal. No. Julian grabbed the closest object, a cast-iron skillet, and swung it at the master with every ounce of strength left in him. The master's head jerked sideways at the impact. The skillet clanged against bone with a sick sound, and Julian staggered from the recoil. The master didn't fall, but he looked surprised. For the first time since Julian met him, the master looked imperfect. He touched his cheek where flakes of blood, beautiful, dark, almost syrup-like, dripped down his jaw. He gazed at the smear of red on his fingertips, breath hitching with something like awe. "Ah," he whispered. "There it is." His eyes lifted to Julian, wide, delighted, hungry. Rage. Julian backed away again, barely able to stand from the adrenaline flooding his body. "Stay away from me," he shouted. But the master shook his head slowly, as though Julian were a child throwing a tantrum. "You don't understand," he murmured. "Rage is almost impossible to harvest properly. It burns too hot, too fast. It spoils before we can catch it." He stepped forward, movements fluid despite the blood streaking his cheek. "But if we push you to the edge of fear, then provoke a pivot to fury, if we force the transformation, then the rage becomes pure. Absolute." Julian's skin crawled as the air around him thickened again, this time not pressing fear into him, but coaxing out something deeper, something painful, something primal. Images flashed through his mind, faces he'd disappointed, chefs who mocked him, critics who dismissed him, readers who ignored him, lovers who left him. Decades of frustration, inadequacy, humiliation. A lifetime of being overlooked, underestimated, undervalued. Every slight tasted metallic on his tongue. Every wound felt like a coal pushed between his ribs. The master whispered, "Yes, yes, let it burn, Julian. Let it rise." Julian gritted his teeth, shaking violently. He felt like he was boiling alive inside his own skin. His hands curled into fists so tight his nails cut his palms. He needed to break something. To destroy something. To hurt someone. And the master saw it. He saw the fury blooming beneath Julian's skin, and his smile sharpened. "Good," he whispered. "Now we finish the recipe." He lunged. Julian reacted without thinking. Not with fear this time. With instinct. With fury. His hand shot toward the stove, grabbing a heavy pot filled with scalding oil. He swung it upward as the master closed in. The oil splashed across the master's shoulder and chest, sizzling on contact. Steam burst into the air, filling the kitchen with the burning scent of flesh and spice. The master screamed, a horrible, inhuman sound that turned into laughter halfway through. "Yes," he roared. Rage. Pure rage. He lunged again. Julian's vision tunneled. He grabbed a chef's knife, turned, and without hesitation, without fear, he plunged the blade into his own forearm. Pain exploded through his body like lightning. He cried out, falling to one knee, blood dripping onto the tile in sharp red droplets. The master froze, for the first time truly stunned. Julian's face twisted in agony, but beneath the pain burned something immense. Something volcanic. Not fear. Not panic. Defiance. "This," Julian screamed, gripping his bleeding arm, "is my emotion. Not yours. Not for your jars. Not for your recipes. Mine." The master stared at him, furious, bewildered, betrayed. "You ruined it," he rasped. "You spoiled the flavor. You tainted the moment." Julian stumbled to his feet, knife still in hand. "Good," he snarled. "I hope it tastes like shame." The master roared, a sound that rattled pans from their hooks, and lunged again, but Julian was already moving. Rage gave him clarity. Pain gave him speed. He hurled the bloody knife at the master, forcing him to dodge. Julian sprinted toward the exit. "You cannot leave," the master bellowed. "The recipe isn't complete." Julian burst through the kitchen door, slipping on the tiles, shoulders slamming into the counter as he pushed himself forward. Behind him, the master screamed with a fury so deep it shook the walls. "You've ruined the ultimate fear. You will never taste perfection again. Julian, your emotion belongs to us." Julian didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't breathe until he hit the icy air outside. He clutched his arm to his chest, blood seeping into the snow, steam rising from the wound, breath stuttering in clouds of white. Behind him, through the alley, he heard it. The heart's doors slamming open. The master's voice echoing through the night. A promise that burned hotter than fire. "We will finish what you started." Julian should have died in the alley behind the hearth. He knew it even now, months later, as he lay awake some nights staring at the ceiling with his injured arm throbbing faintly in the dark like a memory pulsing beneath the skin. The night he escaped the restaurant had unfolded in frantic flashes. Snow melting under the heat of his blood, the world blurring into streaks of amber streetlight and cold stone, the taste of copper filling his mouth with every staggered breath. He remembered running until his legs gave out, collapsing beside a dumpster in the old industrial district, trembling as police sirens approached from somewhere far away. He remembered the paramedics lifting him, asking him who did this, what happened, where the attacker was. He remembered lying. "A mugging," he whispered, voice barely audible. "But I fought back." He didn't remember the hospital except for the warmth of the morphine dripping into his veins, a warmth that felt disturbingly familiar, like stew simmering on a low flame. He forced himself not to think about it, but he couldn't stop the scent from rising in his mind whenever the painkillers kicked in. Something tender, something sweet, something alive. His book came out 4 months later. He hadn't meant to write it. He tried to live quietly, hiding from the world, from the master, from the echo of knives clinking in the dark corners of his mind. But the words kept pressing against the inside of his skull like steam inside a sealed pot, building pressure until he felt he might burst. He couldn't sleep without hearing whispers, flashes of phrases the master had spoken. "Emotion is the purest flavor, ultimate fear, absolute rage. We season the soul." And so he wrote, feverishly, obsessively. For weeks he locked himself in his apartment and typed until his wrists ached, until his wounded arm throbbed deep beneath the bandages, until every light in the room blurred from exhaustion. He didn't write the truth, not all of it. He wrote around the truth. A memoir disguised as a culinary travelogue. A story of a forbidden restaurant. A stew that tasted too perfect. A mysterious chef who vanished without a trace. He trimmed out the supernatural edges, smoothed over the horrors, left out the jars, the cold room, the emotions. But readers felt it anyway, felt the trembling heartbeat beneath the sentences, the unspoken darkness simmering between each line. When the book hit the shelves, it exploded. A masterpiece of food writing. A haunting exploration of flavor and obsession. The hearth feels so real you can almost smell the broth. Julian shook every time he read those reviews. Because the readers could smell it. And he knew why. The book tour was a blur. Interviews. Signings. Endless questions. What inspired this? Did you really eat a stew like that? Is the hearth a real place? Julian dodged and deflected and smiled through clenched teeth. Sometimes he caught a faint scent while standing at a podium. A breeze of thyme layered with something deeper, something metallic, and he would feel the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Sometimes he glimpsed a figure in the crowd, a tall silhouette with silver-gray hair, a black coat, pale hands folded calmly, but when he looked again the figure was gone. He told himself he was imagining it, that trauma was seasoning his vision, that he was simply overtired, overwatched, overworried. But one night, after a signing in Chicago, he found something tucked inside his coat pocket. A jar. Small. Cork-sealed. No wax. No label. Inside, a pale golden liquid shimmered faintly like condensed sunlight. He recognized it instantly. His breath hitched. Aroma vitae. Emotion distilled. Someone's. Or something's. The bottom of the jar was scratched with a single word etched by hand. Curiosity. Julian dropped it. The jar rolled across the hotel carpet, bumping softly against the wall. He pressed a shaking hand to his mouth, nausea twisting his gut. The master was alive. Or worse, not just alive but thriving. Reading his book. Following him. Watching him. Harvesting him in ways Julian couldn't understand. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in the dim hotel room, staring at the jar until dawn, muscles locked tight as if expecting a hand to reach from the shadows and pull him into a simmering pot. More jars followed. Not every day. Not every week. But often enough that Julian's dread developed a rhythm. He'd open a suitcase and find anxiety. He'd return to a dressing room and discover doubt. Once, most horrifyingly, he found a jar labeled joy, still warm to the touch as though freshly harvested. He never opened them. Never smelled them. But he couldn't throw them away either. Part of him feared what would happen if he discarded them. Part of him feared what would happen if he didn't. Meanwhile, the public obsession grew. Readers demanded more details about the hearth. Food bloggers claimed to have tasted the stew and described flavors Julian had never written. Entire online communities formed around decoding his book, hunting for the mystery restaurant, speculating about its location. Crowds gathered in old alleys, swearing they smelled something simmering. Videos went viral of people blindfolded, tasting mystery broths, steeped in emotional metaphors. The world wanted the hearth. And the hearth, Julian feared, wanted the world. One night, after returning home from a televised interview, Julian noticed a smell drifting through his apartment. Not from the kitchen. Not from the hallway. From his study. A rich, warm aroma that wrapped around him like a memory he hadn't lived. He froze outside the door. The scent was potent. Unmistakable. Stew. Simmering. Perfectly balanced. Alive. His pulse throbbed in his ears. Slowly he pushed the door open. A pot sat on his desk. Steam rose in twisting ribbons. The surface of the stew quivered as though breathing. No one was there. The window was locked. The lights were off except for a faint flicker from the stovetop flame beneath the pot. Except Julian didn't have a stove in his study. It was simply there, heat radiating gently, filling the room with a scent that tugged at something deep inside his ribs. A note rested beside it. Handwritten. Elegant. Precise. The recipe was never ruined, Julian. Only delayed. Taste again. You owe us the ending. His hands shook violently. No, he whispered to no one. No, no, no. But the aroma curled around him like smoke, slipping beneath his skin, tugging at memories and emotions he'd buried. He felt grief. Felt longing. Felt fear rising like heat from boiling water. And beneath it all, he felt rage. His own rage. The deep, molten thing he'd summoned in the hearth's kitchen. The rage he'd weaponized. The rage the master had wanted. Julian stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of books. He had to get out. Away from the pot. Away from this impossible set. Away from the master's reach. You ran to the front door. And froze. Someone had slid something under it. A manila envelope. Inside lay a single page from his own manuscript, torn cleanly from the published edition. You recognized the chapter. It was the one describing the stew's taste, the night he first encountered perfection. But someone had crossed out every sentence with red ink except one. Perfection is a flavor that requires surrender. Julian's breath caught. Below the line was a new note, handwritten in the same elegant script. You will return to us, voluntarily or by flavor. Because you know the truth now, Julian. The perfect recipe is never abandoned. It only waits. A final smear of ink curved downward in what might have been a flourish, or a threat, or an invitation. Julian dropped the envelope and staggered back into the hall. He didn't pack. He didn't call anyone. He didn't lock the door. He just ran, not with the stumbling panic of that night in the alley, but with a cold, deliberate urgency. He fled the building, the city, the life he had built. He vanished. Now, if you search far enough, in the right season, in the cold hours after midnight, some people say they've seen a man wandering the countryside. A man who avoids restaurants, who covers his nose when passing chimneys, who flinches at the sound of simmering broth. A man who carries a backpack filled with unopened jars that clink faintly with each step. Some say this man is hunting for the hearth, determined to destroy it. Some say he is running from it. Some say he is seasoning, as all ingredients do, waiting for the moment when he ripens perfectly. And some say that in forgotten alleys, the scent has returned, that the stew is simmering again, that the master has found a new kitchen, a new congregation, a new recipe. But there is one thing everyone agrees on. Julian's book always smells faintly warm, as if the stew never truly cooled, as if someone, somewhere, is still stirring the pot. You're still here. That means the night carried you all the way through, and if it didn't swallow you whole, that's a small miracle in itself. 5 stories. 5 different corners of fear. But if you listen closely, they share a pulse. A reminder that echoes don't always fade, that soldiers never fully leave the battlefield, that art sometimes demands too much from those who admire it, that promises buried under concrete don't stay buried forever. And that flavor, when taken too far, becomes something alive enough to reach back. Maybe you felt it, the soft nudge of something you couldn't name, a flicker behind you, the faintest whisper under the music. That's normal. Night has a way of peeling back the layers we ignore when the sun is out. When this recording ends, the room will feel a little too quiet, the air a little too still. You may hear a sound you've never noticed before, a creak, a scratch, a tiny shift. Don't be alarmed. Stories sometimes cling to the listeners who care the most. If one of tonight's tales follows you into your dreams, be gentle with it. It's only trying to finish what it started. And until we meet again, keep your lights low, your mind open, and your shadows close. Because in the dark, nothing is ever truly alone. Good night, and thank you for listening.